Stefan was just a regular teenager living in a quiet, ordinary suburb. Like most kids his age, he spent his free time hanging out with his friends, playing video games, and occasionally looking for a bit of harmless trouble. In his neighborhood, there was one house that always felt completely out of place. It sat directly across the street from Stefan's home, and from the moment the new occupants moved in, something felt incredibly off. Nobody ever saw anyone enter or leave the property. The blinds on every single window were pulled shut tightly, day and night. There were never any lights on inside, making the house look completely abandoned. Yet there was always a red Toyota pickup truck parked in the driveway. It never moved, but it was always there. The neighborhood kids had no idea who lived there, what they looked like, or what was happening inside those darkened rooms. It became a local mystery, a source of endless speculation during long summer nights. One evening, Stefan and his friends, including the narrator and another kid named Jake, decided to cure their boredom by playing a game of Ding Dong Ditch. For those who do not know, this is a simple game where you run up to someone's front door, ring the bell or knock, and then run away and hide before they can open it. It is a silly, harmless prank that millions of kids have played, but on this particular night, they decided to target the mysterious house with the red truck. Jake and the narrator hid behind a car parked down the street, while Stefan volunteered to run up to the front door. He walked up the dark pathway, reached out, and pressed the doorbell about 5 times in rapid succession. He then sprinted over to a thick bush that separated the target property from the neighboring house and dove inside. The boys waited in breathless silence, expecting a frustrated homeowner to open the door, but nothing happened. The house remained completely dark and silent. Feeling emboldened and a bit mischievous, Stefan crawled out of the bush, ran back to the door, and rang the bell even more times, probably closer to 10 times this time. As he turned to run back to his hiding spot, the narrator, watching from behind the car across the street, noticed something chilling. The heavy curtains of one of the front windows twitched. Someone was definitely inside, watching them. The narrator and Jake were frozen with fear, wanting to scream out to Stefan to stop, but they were too afraid of making noise and giving away their positions. Stefan did not look back at them, so they could not wave him off. After waiting for about 30 seconds in the bush, Stefan decided to go back for one final ring. But before his finger could even touch the doorbell, the heavy front door flew open. An arm reached out from the pitch-black hallway inside the house and grabbed Stefan by the collar of his shirt. Stefan let out a high-pitched scream of absolute terror. He thrashed around wildly, fueled by pure adrenaline, and managed to break free from the man's grip. He sprinted past his friends, crying out as he ran straight to his own house across the street. The heavy door of the mysterious house slammed shut behind him, and no one came out to chase them. The boys gathered inside Stefan's house, hearts hammering in their chests. The narrator warned Stefan that this was a terrible mistake, as the neighbor now knew exactly where he lived. But Stefan was too shaken to care. He told his parents what had happened. They were initially angry at the boys for playing such a foolish prank, but their anger quickly turned to genuine concern when they heard how aggressively the neighbor had tried to drag Stefan inside. Still, they did not want to confront a potentially dangerous neighbor over a game of Ding Dong Ditch. Jake went home, but the narrator stayed for a sleepover. Later that night, long after Stefan's parents had gone to bed, the two boys went into the backyard to hang out. They sat on the grass playing Pokemon on their Nintendo DS handhelds, trying to distract themselves. At one point, the narrator heard a strange, heavy thumping sound nearby. He did not think much of it at the time, assuming it was just a neighborhood animal, so he did not mention it to Svan. Soon, it became too cold to sit outside, so they decided to head back indoors. As soon as they stepped inside, they noticed the temperature on the first floor had dropped significantly. It was freezing. Stefan quickly found the source of the cold draft. The sliding dining room window, which had been locked shut, was now slid open all the way, letting the chilly night air pour into the house. Stefan's parents definitely had not opened it. Before they could even process what this meant, they heard a sudden, heavy footstep from the floor directly above them, right inside Stefan's bedroom. Stefan began screaming for his parents at the top of his lungs. Because of the open floor plan of the house, his parents came rushing out of their bedroom immediately, confused and terrified. The boys pointed to the open window and cried out that someone was upstairs in Stefan's bedroom. Stefan's father acted quickly. He ran down to the kitchen, grabbed the largest, sharpest knife he could find, and went charging up the stairs. The narrator, Stefan, and his mother waited downstairs in absolute terror. They could hear Stefan's father screaming upstairs, not out of fear, but a loud, angry, defensive shout. Stefan's mother hugged the boys tightly, trying to comfort them while dialing the police on her phone. When the police arrived minutes later, they went straight upstairs. The investigation revealed a terrifying sequence of events. The intruder had slipped in through the dining room window and made his way to Stefan's bedroom, hiding inside the closet. When Stefan's father opened the closet door, the intruder lunged at him. Acting on pure instinct, Stefan's father stabbed the man with the kitchen knife. When the police dragged the bleeding intruder out of the house, the boys recognized him immediately. He was wearing the same white-sleeved shirt Stefan had seen when he was grabbed, and his hands had the exact same distinctive scabs on them. It was the creepy neighbor from across the street. He had followed Stefan home, waited for his chance, and broken into his bedroom with unknown, terrifying intentions. Stefan's family immediately obtained a restraining order and refused to spend another night in that house. Within a few months, they packed up their belongings and moved to a different part of town, leaving the nightmare behind. This kind of danger is not an isolated incident. In another quiet neighborhood just a few days ago, a group of teenage friends experienced a similarly terrifying ordeal that escalated into a life-or-death situation. This group of friends consisted of the narrator and his friends, who we will call C, B, E, A, and Ben. They were looking for some excitement on a Friday night and decided to play the exact same game of Ding Dong Ditch. They targeted a large corner house located at the entrance of a quiet cul-de-sac. The narrator went first, walking up to the front stoop, knocking loudly on the door, and then sprinting away. The entire group ran about 3 houses down and hid behind a parked car where they still had a clear view of the front door. A moment later, the front door opened, and a furious man stepped outside. He walked around his yard, looking for the culprits, and spotted the group hiding down the street. He screamed out at them, and the boys scattered, running as fast as they could. They laughed it off, thinking it was just a typical angry reaction. But then, acting like a bunch of reckless teenagers, they made a massive mistake. They agreed to target the exact same house a second time. They walked back around the block to the cul-de-sac. Since the narrator had done the last few houses, they decided it was Ben's turn to ring the bell. Ben walked up to the door, knocked loudly, and ran. The rest of the group was split up. C, B, A, and Ben ran toward the corner of the street, while the narrator and E hid behind a car parked directly across the street from the target house. It was almost as if the homeowner had been waiting right behind the door this time. Only 5 seconds after Ben knocked, the door flew open, and the man came sprinting out into his driveway. He reached the edge of his property and screamed out for them to come back, demanding they face him. Sensing immediate danger, the narrator stood up and sprinted as fast as he could around the block, eventually catching up with Ben, C, A, and B. They stopped to catch their breath and look around, only to realize that E was missing. They called his phone, and E answered, completely out of breath and panicking. He told them that the man was actively chasing him down the dark streets, and that they needed to go back to help him. Then, E dropped a bomb that made everyone's blood run cold. The man had a gun. E told them that as he was running for his life, he heard the man scream out a horrific threat, promising to blow his brains out if he caught him. The narrator began to tear up, overwhelmed by the sudden realization that their silly game had turned into a potentially fatal situation. For 5 agonizing minutes, they stayed on the phone with E, who eventually managed to lose the gunman by hiding underneath a parked car. E finally made it back to the group, completely exhausted but alive. They all hugged him, incredibly grateful that he was safe. Later, when they gathered in A's backyard to calm down, E showed them his phone. He had recorded the entire chase on video. The recording captured the terrifying moment. The man sprinted out of his house and began his hunt. The narrator realized that when he had run away from the car, the man had initially chased him, but then E stood up and ran in the opposite direction. This confused the gunman, who ultimately decided to pursue E instead. If the gunman had chosen to follow the narrator, the outcome could have been tragic. It was a stark reminder of how quickly a childish prank can provoke a deadly response from a deeply unstable individual. Sometimes, the danger does not just chase you down the street. It follows you all the way back to your hiding spot, using the very toys you brought with you. Another young man who grew up as a very sheltered child recalled a terrifying experience from his youth that still haunts him to this day. Because he did not go out much during his high school years, he jumped at any opportunity to do something slightly rebellious. His cousin Rob, who was older and infinitely cooler, was always down to get into trouble. One dark night, Rob called him and suggested they go ding-dong ditch. The neighborhood was rural, with houses spaced far apart and very few streetlights to illuminate the dark roads. To make the game more exciting, Rob brought along 2 walkie-talkies, handing one to the narrator and a flashlight. They walked down the dark road, eventually veering off the pavement and cutting through a dense patch of trees onto a large, isolated property. The house was dark, with only a single walkway lamp casting a dim glow on the front yard. Rob came up with a plan. He wanted to make the homeowner run back and forth, confused by doorbells ringing at both the front and back of the house. He told the narrator to creep around to the back door and wait for his signal over the walkie-talkie. The backyard was pitch black and incredibly quiet. The narrator was terrified, but he did not want to look cowardly in front of his cousin. They tested the walkie-talkies, and the signal was clear. Rob gave the go-ahead, ringing the front bell multiple times. The narrator then ran up, pressed the back doorbell twice, and scrambled back to hide behind a thick bush. He whispered into his walkie-talkie, asking Rob if anyone had come out front. Rob replied that nothing was happening. Rob told the narrator to get closer to the back door to see if anyone was inside. The narrator approached a large back window and peered into the darkness. He could barely make out the interior, except for a tall, dark shape positioned right in front of the window and a small red flashing light in the corner of the room. Rob rang the front bell again. The narrator, waiting for his turn, rang the back bell twice. As he retreated to his bush, he noticed something moving inside the dark window. It was a small movement, barely visible in the shadows. He whispered this to Rob over the walkie-talkie. Rob, trying to be brave, told him to shine his flashlight through the window to see what it was. The narrator stepped out of the bush, approached the glass, and flicked on his flashlight. The bright beam pierced the darkness inside the house, revealing a horrifying sight. The tall, dark object he thought was a piece of furniture was actually a man standing perfectly still right behind the glass. He had a creepy, wide smile plastered across his face, and the movement the narrator had seen was the man slowly waving his hand at him. Before the narrator could even scream, the smiling man turned and walked away from the window at an unsettlingly fast pace, heading straight for the back door. He threw the door open and stepped out into the dark yard, speed-walking directly toward the narrator. He did not yell or scream. Instead, he spoke in a calm, terrifying voice, asking the narrator to step inside his home. The narrator dropped his walkie-talkie in pure panic, screamed, and ran toward the front of the house where Rob was waiting. Rob saw the sheer terror on his cousin's face, and then spotted the smiling man quickly approaching them from the side of the house. Maintaining that same rapid, silent speed walk, both boys sprinted down the driveway, through the trees, and did not stop running until they reached the safety of Rob's basement. They locked the door, turned off all the lights, and sat in the dark, gasping for breath. Just as they began to think they were safe, the walkie-talkie in Rob's hand crackled to life. A heavy, ragged breathing sound came through the speaker, followed by the dry, whispering voice of an old man. He asked where they were, telling them he was not going to hurt them, and that he just wanted to return the walkie-talkie they had dropped in his yard. The realization of what was happening struck them with a wave of absolute horror. The walkie-talkies they were using were cheap toys with a very limited range. For the signal to reach them clearly inside a concrete basement, the man had to be standing right outside Rob's house, searching for them in the dark. He had followed them all the way home, terrified that the man would see them or find a way inside. They switched off the walkie-talkie and remained frozen in the dark, praying he would go away. They never told their parents about the incident, fearing they would be grounded for playing pranks late at night. It remained a dark, disturbing secret between the two cousins. These 3 stories serve as a chilling warning about the hidden dangers lurking in our own neighborhoods. We often view our suburbs as safe, peaceful havens where children can play without fear. But behind the closed blinds and dark windows of the houses we pass every day, we never truly know who is watching, waiting, or looking for an opportunity to turn an innocent childhood game into a horrific nightmare. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. This happened when I was 15 years old. My best friend Anthony wanted me to come over for the night since his parents would be gone all weekend. I rode my bike over and put it in his backyard before letting myself in through his back door. We played basically every video game he had, from FIFA all the way to Call of Duty, with popcorn and other junk food spilled out all over the floor. As the night progressed, we moved from video games to watching half a movie and getting bored, to doing prank calls. At close to 10 o'clock, Anthony made a few calls to different pizza places. When it was my turn, I just dialed a few random numbers in hopes to get someone at their house. On my 4th attempt, I finally reached somebody. A guy with a deep and rough voice picked up, answering with a yeah instead of a hello. Anthony's laughing in the background made me stumble with my words mid-sentence, ultimately cracking up into laughter. I had never done a prank call, so I sucked at it. The guy on the other end was silent. I regained a straight face and tried to continue. I asked if it would be all right if I borrowed one of the wheels from his car. The man asked what my name was. I said my name was Bob. He asked if I was sure it was not Anthony. It hit me like a brick. I looked up at Anthony, whose face was noticeably full of fear. I hung up the phone, not wanting to be on the line with whoever that was for another second. I asked him who the hell that was, but he told me he did not know. I asked if his caller ID info displays his name, but he said it shows his dad's name. We hopped on the computer and did some research, trying to figure out how it was possible to get someone's name through their phone number. It did not make sense how he could get Anthony's name so quickly. He was way too young at the time to be on any of those personal information sharing websites. We ended up asking a question on Yahoo Answers, since no one had a similar experience, but the question turned up no answers. I suggested he call his dad, but he said he was not supposed to have anybody over for the weekend, so he did not want to call. We planned on sleeping in the living room, so we just resumed watching the movie that we had not finished from earlier. Right after the phone call had left my mind, me and Anthony looked at each other when we heard his front storm door opening. Then, the doorknob to the front door began to turn. It only was able to turn about halfway before the lock restricted it. Anthony turned off the TV, and I went over to the window to see who it was. I spread the blinds open. There was a tall guy standing outside. He noticed the blinds moving and turned to look at me. I practically threw the blinds back into place. Me and Anthony hid in the kitchen, listening for any more noises. We heard the sound of the gate to the backyard opening. As it was right outside the kitchen window, I realized I had forgotten to shut the back door when I came in. Anthony urged me to run and shut it. I made it to the hallway leading to his back door and froze. There was a silhouette standing outside the back door. I do not think he noticed me, but he was surely looking into the house. He opened the door and stepped inside. I tiptoed to the kitchen and motioned for Anthony to follow me upstairs. We made it to his room as quietly as possible, pulling the door shut to avoid making any noise. We crawled under his bed. He had cloth covering the bottom of his bed, so you could not see anything under it unless you actually moved the cloth. The doors downstairs all opened, each one getting closer to the stairs. Thumps finally began up the stairs, and he was right outside the door now. The door to the room opened. I could hear Anthony's breathing, and it was too loud. Footsteps moved over to the closet, and then the closet opened. I could hear the coat hangers being slid around as the fabric of the jackets and coats rubbed against each other. Footsteps moved over to the bed and stopped. I felt like my heart was about to explode out of my chest. Anthony's breathing was too loud, so I had to cover his mouth with my hand. There was nothing but silence in the room now. We laid still for so long, I almost thought he was not even in the room anymore. I moved my hand away from Anthony's mouth and whispered in his ear, asking if he thought we could make a run for it. He was about to answer when the most disturbing, memory-haunting scream I had ever heard filled my ears. Anthony was suddenly dragged out from under the bed. I crawled out and saw him struggling with the man. I desperately looked around for anything to use as a weapon. I settled with the screwdriver sitting on his nightstand. I hurried over to the man and drove the screwdriver deep into his back. He let go of Anthony as he let out a scream of agony, giving us time to get the hell out of the house. Running onto the road would give away our position too easily, and it would take too long to make it to his neighbor's house. We dove for the tree line in the woods and took cover behind a bush. Watching the house, the back door opened as the man stepped outside, looking around the backyard. He then looked out to the woods. I felt his eyes pass me as he scanned through the tree line. It seemed that it was too dark for him to see us. Then, he turned his head back in our direction. I ducked behind the bush. Anthony whispered that he was coming. He was right. The man was approaching us fast. How could he have seen us? We ran through the woods with the leaves crunching under us, giving away our position when Anthony tripped over something. I crouched down with him, hoping we had run far enough. Not even 20 seconds later, oncoming footsteps from the direction we were running from came fast. They slowed down only 2 trees away from us as we lay face down in the leaves. Moments later, the footsteps take off in another direction. We waited until we could no longer hear them and took off back in the direction of the house. While running over the sound of leaves crunching and my heavy breathing, I could swear I heard leaves crunching from behind us. We made it back to his backyard and into his house. This time, remembering to shut the back door, we were now able to call the police. Anthony stayed on the line with them while I patrolled the back windows, making sure nobody was out there. It was so dark, though, I could not see anything, so I did something that seemed stupid today. I turned on his backyard lights, and immediately in the distance over by the woods, I saw him standing in front of a big tree. He turned off back into the woods and disappeared out of sight. That was the last time either me or Anthony ever saw him. The police came and searched, but found nothing. I would be lying if I told you we heard the occasional locks at our windows or something cliché. No, that was it. 5 years have passed and nothing has happened. Do I wonder if it was somehow linked to the prank call? Maybe. Does it make sense? Not really. But yeah, this was the story of how me and my still best friend Anthony almost died during a home break-in. Now, let's fast forward to a completely different night, but one that is just as terrifying. Me and my wife have had our fair share of arguments, but there was this one night that she would not stop screaming over the stupidest thing. It got to the point where I forgot to put the toilet seat down, and she lectured me at the top of her lungs with an ear-piercing voice. I just could not take it anymore. I called my buddy Paul up, and he told me I could crash there for the night. I was exhausted, and I did not need to deal with my crazy wife at the time. Paul had a huge house, which was another thing my wife always yelled at me about, how all my friends have nicer houses than us. We had a few beers and had a normal chat about life. He suggested I stay there for as long as I needed, but I assured him I would only stay for one night as I did not want to be a bother. I slept in one of his guest bedrooms. Surprisingly, he has 3 guest bedrooms, but has only needed to use one of them so far. He never uses the other 2 bedrooms, and only plans on using them for a party or something like that. All 3 guest bedrooms in the house are lined up next to each other, while Paul's bedroom is across the hall. It is a weird setup for sure, but it let me hear strange noises coming from the next room over. I assumed it was Paul doing something in there, but it quickly got annoying, so I decided to just walk over and see what was going on. I tried the doorknob, but it was locked. I cracked the door open to Paul's room and asked him what the noise was. He was already in bed as well and did not hear anything. Upon asking why he kept the door locked, he told me he always keeps those 2 doors locked as he keeps some personal belongings in there. I warned him that there was a strange noise coming from the room, and he told me to just go back to sleep, and if I continue to hear it, to come back to him. So I did. I went back to bed, and the noises were completely gone now. A half hour passed, and I was starting to drift off to sleep at last when I heard the slightest tap on the wall. It came from the other side, the next room over. It was followed by a faint, low whispering voice. I jolted up from the bed and ran back to Paul's room. This time Paul took me seriously. He got the key to the 2 doors and unlocked the one next to mine. We stepped inside and felt a cold breeze hit us on the way in. The window was completely open. Along with the closet, we dug through the entire room. The bed had marks on it as if someone were on it. The closet was full of empty bags, and his valuable belongings that were in his drawers were gone. Paul suddenly ran out to the hallway. I was confused at first, but I caught on quickly as he was checking the other room. I was right by his side as he unlocked the door to the third guest bedroom, and the first thing we saw was a black figure jumping out the window onto the patio roof. Paul was about to jump out after him, but we instead both ran outside through the back door in hopes to catch him. He was gone already. It is a good thing we did not catch him, though, because what we found in this room was far more disturbing. The white sheets on the bed were stained with fresh blood. The closet had the butcher knife he had been missing sitting on the floor with a few blood spots on it, and of course, all of his valuable belongings were gone from the room. These people, most likely homeless and dangerous drug addicts, were living in his home for more than a week. It made sense of how fast his food had been disappearing lately. As far as we know, they were never caught. This brings me to the final story, my first sleepover at age 10. My friend Jordan had a huge finished basement where we played video games until late. We eventually fell asleep on the couches. I woke up later in the dark. The television was on with a blank screen, casting a very dim light. In the far corner by the stairs, I noticed a very tall, dark object. It almost reached the ceiling. Suddenly, the television shut off completely, plunging the basement into pitch-black darkness. I shut my eyes in sheer terror and stayed motionless, trying not to make any sound. The next morning, I woke up to frantic screams from upstairs. It was Jordan's mom. We ran up to find his mom crying as his dad searched the house. He found no signs of entry or forced locks on any windows. Years later, Jordan admitted his mom saw a tall, dark figure standing by her door that night. I am absolutely certain that was the exact same creepy shadow thing I saw in the basement. Something was definitely in that house with us. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Halloween is supposed to be a night of harmless fun. We dress up in costumes, pretend to be things that scare us, and walk through neighborhoods filled with laughter and bright lights. But sometimes, the costumes we see are not meant for fun. Sometimes, they are used to hide something much darker. Our first story takes place on Halloween night in 2023. At the time, I was 22 years old and worked as a community worker. If you have ever worked in community service, you know how incredibly exhausting it can be. We had just finished hosting a massive festival at our local community center. It was a long, draining day. We had parent-teacher events, competitive games, trivia contests for candy, and even a chaotic dodgeball game where kids faced off against parents. By the time everything wrapped up, I was completely worn out. My legs ached, my throat was sore from shouting rules, and all I wanted to do was go home, order some warm food, and crash on my couch. I got back to my apartment around 5 in the afternoon. I kicked off my shoes and was just starting to relax when my phone rang. It was around 6 when I saw my little sister Savannah was calling me. Savannah was 15 at the time. She told me that she and our 11-year-old nephew Jackson really wanted to go trick-or-treating. The problem was that neither our parents nor Jackson's parents felt like taking them out. They were all too tired from their own busy work weeks. As it usually goes in my family, the responsibility fell on me to be the cool older brother and make it happen. I was absolutely exhausted, and every muscle in my body was begging me to stay on the couch. But I could not bring myself to say no to them and ruin their holiday. I got off the couch, threw on some warm clothes, and drove over to my parents' house to pick them up. When I arrived, Savannah was still putting the final touches on her costume. She was dressed as Raven from the Teen Titans. She had gone all out, even putting on pale white makeup to give herself that ghostly, dark appearance that the character is known for. Jackson was dressed as Sub-Zero from Mortal Kombat, complete with a plastic mask and blue armor pieces. He kept showing off his martial arts moves in the living room, completely energized. Once they were ready, we piled into my car and drove to a nearby neighborhood. I chose a busy, upscale neighborhood because I knew they would get the best candy there, and it would be a safe environment for them. For the first couple of hours, everything was great. The neighborhood was packed with families, and the houses were beautifully decorated with glowing pumpkins and fake spider webs. The vibe was incredibly friendly and welcoming. We even ran into an older man who was standing in his driveway next to a large black grill. Instead of handing out candy, he was grilling hot dogs and giving them out alongside cans of soda. He explained to us that he did this every year because he wanted the kids to have some actual protein to balance out all the sugar they were eating. Honestly, it was a really nice gesture, and we need more people like him. We continued walking down the streets, collecting a huge amount of chocolate. Other kids kept complimenting Savannah and Jackson on their costumes, and we were all having a good time. But by the time we hit the last house on our list, it was getting late. The crowd had started to thin out, and the neighborhood was becoming quiet. The laughter of children faded into the background. We began the 10-minute walk back to my car, which was parked quite a distance away. As we walked, the lively atmosphere faded, and the streets grew dark and silent. That is when I noticed something across the street. I have always been someone who pays close attention to my surroundings, a habit that probably saved us that night. In the yard of a house with absolutely no porch lights on, a figure was standing completely still. The house was pitch black, which made this person stand out even more. I squinted to get a better look in the dim light of the street lamps. The person was wearing an all-black outfit with a hooded cloak and some kind of mask. I could not see a single patch of skin, and I could not tell if it was a man or a woman. But what disturbed me the most was that this person was facing us, tracking our movements as we walked down the sidewalk. They did not move a muscle, but their head turned slowly as we passed. I immediately felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I leaned down and whispered to Savannah and Jackson, telling them to stay very close to me. I said, "There is a suspicious person across the yard. Look, but do not stare." I did not want them to cause a scene or make the person think we were confronting them, but I wanted them to be aware. Jackson laughed, thinking it was just a neighbor trying to scare passers-by. But Savannah, who was older, looked visibly worried. She knew that I always carry a backpack with my Glock inside. The moment I told them to stay close, she realized I was not joking. We kept walking, but the feeling of being watched did not go away. I glanced back over my shoulder, and my heart skipped a beat. The figure in the cloak had stepped out of the dark yard and was now walking on the sidewalk behind us. But they were not just walking anymore. I heard the distinct heavy thud of tactical boots hitting the concrete. As they got closer, I could see them clearer under a street lamp. This was not a regular Halloween costume. Under the black cloak, the person was wearing a heavy tactical vest, combat pants tucked into their boots, and a tight black spandex mask that completely covered their head and face. Seeing someone in tactical gear on a dark street changes the situation entirely. It instantly tells you that this person might be armed and dangerous. I turned to Savannah and Jackson and spoke in a low, serious voice. I told them, "Do not stop walking and do not look back. The person behind us is following us. Keep your composure and just keep moving forward." I looked directly at Jackson to make sure he understood, and he stopped laughing. The figure maintained a constant distance behind us, matching our pace step for step. When we finally reached my car, they were still heading straight toward us, closing the gap. At this point, I knew I had to make a decision. I could not risk trying to unlock the doors and load the kids into the car while an armed stranger closed the distance. I reached into my backpack, pulled out my Glock, and pointed it directly at the figure. I yelled out, "Why are you following us?" The person stopped instantly. They slowly raised their hands in the air, seemingly surprised that I was armed. Then, they reached up and pulled off the spandex mask. It was a woman, probably in her mid-30s. She did not look afraid. She just stood there, staring at me with a blank, empty expression. I kept my gun raised and asked again, "Why are you following us?" She finally spoke, but her voice was completely robotic and devoid of emotion. She said, "I am an undercover cop. I was told there was a break-in in this area, so I came to check it out. That is why I was standing outside that house. When you looked at me funny, I assumed you were the one who did it. It would be wise to lower your weapon now, or I can have you arrested for threatening an officer of the law." I hesitated. The logical part of my brain was screaming that her story made absolutely no sense. If she was an undercover cop, why was she wearing a hooded cloak over tactical gear? Why would she be standing alone in a dark yard, facing away from the house she was supposedly protecting? And why would she assume a guy walking with two kids in bright Halloween costumes was a burglar? But I was also terrified of making a mistake. I did not want to get arrested in front of my sister and nephew, and I did not want to escalate a situation if she actually was law enforcement. I slowly lowered my gun, but I did not put it away. I asked her, "If you are undercover, why are you wearing tactical gear that clearly identifies you? And what is the point of the cloak?" She did not answer. Instead, her blank expression shifted into something truly malicious. She looked irritated that I was questioning her, like she was calculating her next move. Savannah and Jackson stood frozen next to me, completely silent. Then, the woman smiled a creepy, unsettling smile. She looked at me and said, "If you did not have that gun, this night would have ended a hell of a lot different for you." Right as the words left her mouth, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. 4 figures stepped out from the shadows between the houses nearby. They were all dressed in the exact same tactical gear, but without the cloaks. There were 3 men and another woman. I did not wait to see what they would do next. I screamed at Savannah and Jackson to get in the car immediately. I watched them scramble into the back seat, keeping my gun pointed at the group. The moment they were inside, I jumped into the driver's seat, locked the doors, started the engine, and slammed on the gas. As we peeled away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The woman was still standing under the street lamp, wearing that awful smile. The other 4 stood beside her, completely motionless, with blank, empty faces that did not look human. The entire car ride back to my parents' house was dead silent. The kids were in complete shock, and my hands were shaking so hard on the steering wheel that I could barely keep the car straight. I dropped them off, walked them to the door to make sure they were safe inside, and then drove back to my apartment. I spent the entire night trying to process what had just happened. Why did they target us? The neighborhood had been full of families just minutes before. Why did they choose to follow us? The nightmare did not end there. A few days later, I received a text message from an unknown number. There was no text, just a single photograph. It was a picture of my car, taken from behind, parked in the lot of my own apartment complex. I immediately contacted the police and explained everything that had happened on Halloween night, as well as the text message. But the officers told me there was nothing they could do. Since no direct threat had been made in the text, they could not launch an investigation. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I decided to go back to that neighborhood. I drove to the exact house where I had first seen the woman standing in the dark yard. I walked up to the porch and knocked on the door. A man in his late 40s answered. I asked him if his house had been broken into on Halloween night, or if there had been any police activity. He looked at me like I was crazy. He said no, nothing had happened. He had gone to bed early that night because he had to work the next morning, and his street had been completely quiet. That confirmed my worst fears. The woman was absolutely not a cop. She and her group were impersonating law enforcement, and they were hunting for targets in the dark. Somehow, they had tracked my license plate, found out where I lived, and got my phone number. I was consumed by paranoia for months. I ended up going to therapy to deal with the anxiety, and I installed a high-tech security system with a Ring camera at my front door. I have not received any more strange messages since then, and nothing else has happened. But 2 years later, I still look over my shoulder every time I walk to my car at night. Being armed that night is the only reason my sister, my nephew, and I made it home safely. Our second story takes place when I was 12 years old. My family decided to do something different for Halloween that year. Instead of going trick-or-treating in our usual suburban neighborhood, my parents booked a cabin at a small family resort about an hour away from our town. The resort was hosting a special Halloween weekend event. It was a cozy, isolated place surrounded by dense woods on all sides. It had about 10 guest cabins, a rustic main lodge, a small lake, and a large open field where they set up games, campfires, and a haunted hayride. During the day, the place looked beautiful and peaceful, with the autumn leaves turning bright orange and red. But once the sun went down, the woods became pitch black, and the silence of the forest was almost deafening. We checked in early on Saturday afternoon. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and sweet candy apples. Kids were already running around in their costumes, laughing and playing. My parents told me that the scheduled activities would start around 5, and the big haunted hayride would begin at 7. While my parents unpacked our bags in the cabin, I went out to explore the resort grounds. That is where I met another kid named Ryan, who was also 12. He was staying in the cabin right next to ours, and was wearing a classic skeleton costume. We quickly became friends and spent the afternoon playing carnival games near the lodge, tossing rings over bottles, and collecting small bags of candy from the resort staff. As 7 o'clock approached, a large crowd of families began gathering near the old wooden barn where the hayride was starting. A large tractor was hooked up to a long wooden wagon filled with hay bales for seating. About 20 of us climbed aboard, excited for the ride. The driver of the tractor was wearing a creepy scarecrow mask, and several resort employees dressed as classic movie monsters were hiding along the trail to jump out and scare us. The tractor started up with a loud rumble, and we slowly rolled into the dark woods. The path was lit only by flickering tiki torches placed every few dozen yards. At first, it was a lot of fun. People would scream when a worker dressed as a zombie jumped out from behind a tree, and then everyone would laugh. But about halfway through the ride, we entered a particularly dark stretch of the trail where there were no torches. The tractor slowed down to a crawl. I looked out into the trees on my side of the wagon, squinting into the darkness. Just at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the faint light, a man was standing. I knew immediately that he was not part of the resort's performance. The actors were all wearing elaborate monster costumes and moving around energetically. This man was wearing a plain dark jacket, blue jeans, and a baseball cap pulled down low over his eyes. He was standing completely still, with his hands buried deep in his pockets, watching the wagon roll past. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Even though his face was hidden in the shadow of his cap, I could feel his eyes locked directly onto me. I looked around the wagon to see if any of the parents or other kids had noticed him, but everyone was laughing and looking at a zombie actor on the other side. When I turned back to the woods, the man was still there, staring. Eventually, the tractor picked up speed and we moved past him. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself he was probably just a parent who wanted to watch the ride from the woods. But deep down, I knew that did not make sense. When the ride ended and we got off the wagon, I glanced back toward the dark trail. The man was gone. I decided not to say anything to my parents. I did not want to seem like a coward or ruin the fun night we were having. Ryan and I headed toward the main lodge, where the resort was hosting a post-ride social with cider and donuts. My parents sat down by a large bonfire with some other adults, while Ryan and I stood near the snack tables. About an hour later, I looked toward the edge of the crowd. My heart nearly stopped. Standing near the dark tree line, just on the border of the firelight, was the same man in the black jacket and baseball cap. He was standing alone, watching the families. He was not talking to anyone, and he did not have a plate of food or a drink. He was just observing. I nudged Ryan and pointed him out. I whispered, "Look over there. That is the guy I saw standing in the woods during the hayride." Ryan looked over, squinting. He shrugged and said, "Maybe he is one of the resort workers taking a break." I told him, "No, he is not. He does not have a costume, and he was standing way out in the dark by himself." Ryan suggested that maybe he was just someone's dad. I tried to convince myself that was the truth, but the way the man was staring at us made me feel sick. A few minutes later, when I looked back at the tree line, he had vanished into the shadows once again. By 9 o'clock, the younger kids had gone back to their cabins, and the bonfire was starting to die down. The resort grounds were getting quiet, but Ryan and I still had plenty of energy. We decided to go for a walk before heading inside for the night. Behind the cabins, there was a narrow dirt path that wound deep into the forest. Ryan suggested we walk a little way down the trail to see how scary it was in the dark. I did not want to go, but I also did not want Ryan to think I was scared, so I agreed. We grabbed our flashlights and stepped onto the path. The air was cold, and the only sound was the dry leaves crunching under our sneakers. We walked about 200 yards into the woods until we reached a small clearing. Nailed to a large pine tree was an old, weathered sign that read "Private Property." We stood there for a few minutes, throwing pebbles at the sign and joking about ghosts. But then, we heard a sound that made us freeze. It was the sound of heavy footsteps. The steps were coming from the dark path ahead of us, deeper in the woods. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy. This was not a small animal. It was a grown adult walking toward us. Ryan whispered, "Is that another kid trying to scare us?" I did not answer. I raised my flashlight and pointed the beam down the path. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but the path bent slightly, and I could not see who was walking. Then, the footsteps stopped. The forest went completely silent. We stood there, holding our breath, waiting. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the trees. It was a man's voice, calm, low, and terrifyingly close. He said, "Hey there, boys." The man stepped out from behind a large oak tree, right into the edge of my flashlight beam. It was him, the same black jacket, the same baseball cap. "What are you two doing out here so late?" he asked. "Do you like candy?" Neither of us could speak. Our legs felt like lead. The man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a large chocolate bar. He held it up so the flashlight caught the bright orange wrapper. "I have a whole box of these back in my cabin," he said, taking a slow step toward us. "Come on with me, and I will let you have as much as you want." I looked at Ryan. In the faint light of my flashlight, I could see that his face was completely white. He was trembling. The man took another step forward. His voice dropped to a whisper. "You do not have to be afraid of me. It is Halloween. I saw you two on the hayride earlier, and I just wanted to share some treats." Hearing him admit that he had been watching us on the ride made something click in my brain. This was not a friendly guest. This was a predator. I grabbed Ryan's arm as hard as I could and screamed, "Run!" We spun around and sprinted down the dark path back toward the resort. Behind us, I heard the sudden violent crash of branches and heavy boots pounding against the dirt. He was chasing us. We ran faster than I ever thought possible. The path felt endless, and the darkness seemed to close in around us. I could hear his heavy breathing and the sound of his boots getting closer. I did not look back. I knew that if I tripped, I would not get back up. Finally, the lights of the resort cabins broke through the trees. We burst out of the woods and ran screaming toward the remaining adults sitting by the dying bonfire. Our parents jumped up, startled by our screams. We collapsed onto the grass, gasping for air, pointing back toward the dark trail. My dad and another parent grabbed their heavy flashlights and ran toward the path, while the resort staff called the police. They searched the immediate area, but the woods were too vast, and the man had easily slipped away into the night. The state police arrived 30 minutes later. They took our statements and searched the property with dogs, but they found nothing. No one matching the man's description had checked into any of the cabins, and there were no strange vehicles parked nearby. The police concluded that he was likely a local trespasser who had slipped onto the property through the woods. We spent the rest of the night locked inside our cabin with the lights on, while my dad stood watch by the window. I did not sleep a single wink. The next morning, we packed our bags and left the resort. As our car pulled out of the driveway, I stared into the dense forest, half expecting to see that black jacket standing among the trees. I never saw him again, and the police never found out who he was. But now that I am older, I realize just how close we came to vanishing into those woods forever. Our third story comes from a man named Roger, who experienced a terrifying home invasion on Halloween night 3 years ago. At the time, Roger was 29 years old and worked a routine office job in the city. He had recently bought a small, older home on the quiet outskirts of town. It was a peaceful neighborhood, but the houses were spaced far apart, and the streets got incredibly dark at night due to a lack of street lamps. That year, Halloween fell on a Saturday. Roger's girlfriend was out of town visiting her parents, so he was home alone. He spent the evening handing out candy to the local kids, but by 9 o'clock, the streets were completely empty and the neighborhood had gone quiet. Roger turned off his porch light, locked the front door, and decided to settle in for the night. He was sitting on his living room couch, eating some leftover chocolate and watching a horror movie on TV. The house was cozy and warm, and he felt completely safe. Around 10:30, Roger heard a faint, distinct sound. It was a soft knock. He paused the movie and listened closely. The sound had come from his side door, which led out to his driveway. Roger got up and walked to the kitchen, which connected to the side door. He peeked through the small window, but the driveway was empty. He figured it was just some local teenagers playing a classic game of knock, double knock, and run. It was Halloween, after all, and pranks were to be expected. He locked the deadbolt, went back to the living room, and pressed play on his movie. 15 minutes passed. Suddenly, a different sound echoed through the house. This time, it was coming from the back of the house where a sliding glass door led onto a small wooden deck. It was not a knock. It was the distinct, metallic rattling of a doorknob being turned. Roger froze. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. Nobody used the back deck. It was surrounded by a high wooden fence and could only be accessed by walking through the dark side yard. He crept back into the kitchen, keeping his body low to avoid being seen through the windows. The TV was still playing in the other room, but he could hear the sound clearly now. Someone was testing the lock on the back door, trying to open it slowly and quietly. Roger crawled toward the kitchen window that overlooked the deck. He carefully raised his head and looked out. Standing on his deck was a man. The man was wearing dark, heavy clothing. Pulled up onto the top of his head was a cheap, cracked plastic Halloween mask. But he was not there to play a prank. In his right hand, he was holding a heavy steel crowbar. He was not acting like a typical burglar who would run if they knew someone was home. He was calm, focused, and deliberate. He stood there, staring at the locked door, as if deciding how to break it down. Roger realized with absolute terror that the man knew he was inside. The lights in the house were on, and the television was audible. This person did not care that the house was occupied. In fact, that seemed to be exactly what he wanted. Roger reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed 911. He retreated to the hallway, speaking in a frantic whisper to the emergency operator. He explained that an armed man was on his back deck trying to break into his house. The operator told him to remain calm, find a secure room to lock himself in, and stay on the line. She assured him that police officers were being dispatched to his address immediately. Roger decided to head toward the stairs leading to the second floor. But before he could make a move, he heard the man step off the deck. The footsteps crunched on the gravel path along the side of the house. Then, Roger heard the sharpest scraping sound of metal against metal. The man was at the low basement window. He was using the crowbar to pry off the security screen. Roger whispered into the phone. "He is trying the basement window now. Please hurry." The operator kept talking to him, trying to keep him focused. She told him, "The officers are on their way, Roger. Just find a place to hide. Do you have a weapon?" Roger ran to the kitchen counter, grabbed a large, heavy chef's knife, and ran up the stairs to the second floor landing. He stood at the top of the stairs, clutching the knife in one hand and his phone in the other, staring down into the dark hallway. Then, the sound he had been dreading echoed from below. It was the loud, violent smash of breaking glass. The man had shattered the basement window. Roger felt his stomach drop. He heard the heavy, muffled thud of the intruder climbing through the broken window frame and stepping onto the concrete floor of his basement. Roger whispered into the phone, "He is inside. He is in the basement." The operator told him, "Stay where you are, Roger. Do not go down there. The police are pulling up to your street right now." Roger held his breath, listening to the sounds from below. He expected to hear the basement door creak open, but instead, he heard the footsteps move back toward the outside. It turned out the intruder had stepped back out of the window to check his surroundings. Suddenly, bright headlights swept across the living room window blinds. The blue and red emergency lights illuminated the entire street. Roger ran to the front bedroom window and looked out. He saw two police cruisers pull up onto his grass, their tires tearing up the lawn. The man in the dark clothes bolted from the side yard, sprinting toward the dark woods behind Roger's property. But the officers were incredibly fast. They jumped out of their cars, drew their weapons, and yelled for him to stop. One of the officers tackled the intruder to the ground just past the edge of the driveway. After a brief struggle, they had him in handcuffs. Roger walked downstairs, his legs shaking so badly he could barely stand. He opened the front door, showing the officers that he was unharmed. When the police searched the intruder's backpack, they found items that proved this was not a simple burglary. Inside the bag, the man was carrying a loaded Colt .45 handgun, several heavy-duty kitchen knives, a roll of duct tape, a bundle of thick nylon rope, and several industrial zip ties. The police officers looked at Roger with grave expressions. One of them told him, "You are incredibly lucky you called us when you did. This guy did not come here to steal your television." It was later revealed during the investigation that the intruder had a long history of violent offenses and breaking into occupied homes. The police suspected him of being connected to several unsolved missing persons cases in the neighboring counties. He had chosen Roger's house because it was isolated, and he had seen Roger's girlfriend leave the day before. Realizing Roger was home alone, Roger ended up selling the house a few months later. He could not stand to live in a place where he had been hunted. Even now, 3 years later, he cannot spend Halloween night alone. These 3 encounters show us that the true horrors of Halloween do not come from the supernatural. They do not come from ghosts, ghouls, or monsters in movies. The real terror comes from the people who walk among us, using the cover of a holiday to hide their dark, twisted intentions. Whether they are posing as law enforcement on a dark street, lurking in the woods of a quiet resort, or breaking into a quiet suburban home, the monsters are very real. So, when you go out tonight, pay attention to the shadows. Watch the people around you, and never assume that the person behind the mask is just playing a game. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Chris was 17 years old during the summer this all happened. It was one of those summers that seemed to drag on forever, where the days were hot and the nights were long, and there was absolutely nothing to do in his childhood hometown. Like a lot of teenagers his age, Chris needed money. His parents were very clear about the fact that he could not just sit around the house all summer doing nothing. They told him he had to get a job, or they would make his life miserable. So, he went out looking for work, and the only place that was hiring was a small, rundown pizza place on the absolute outskirts of town. Chris was not thrilled about it, but he did not have many options. He took the job. The pay was bad, the uniform was sticky and uncomfortable, and the delivery car they made him drive was a complete piece of junk. It was a beat-up old sedan that shook whenever he went over 40 miles per hour and barely made it up the steeper hills in the area. At least he did not have to use his own car, because that would have really sucked. The pizza place itself was not exactly a local favorite. In fact, the pizza was god-awful. Chris genuinely could not understand why anyone would ever order from there. It was terrible. The crust was cardboard, the sauce was bland, and the cheese always tasted a little sour. If it was not for the online ordering system they had recently installed, and the relatively nice atmosphere of the dine-in area, Chris was convinced they would never have gotten a single order. That place was definitely the thing Chris missed the least about his hometown. And that was saying a lot, because the food was so bad and the location was so far away from the main part of town. The shifts were incredibly slow. Most nights were dead quiet. Chris would spend hours just sitting on a metal folding chair in the back, or cleaning the same clean metal counter over and over again. He did not want to bore anyone with the mundane details of how his typical night unfolded. It was just a standard boring pizza job. You can easily fill in the blanks yourself. One particular night, Chris was doing his usual routine. He was restocking the heavy glass door fridge with sodas, feeling the cold air blast his face, when the order tablet on the counter buzzed. It was a loud, high-pitched noise that always startled him. He walked over to check the screen. The order was for a large sausage and olive pizza. Chris remembered that detail distinctly because almost nobody ever ordered olives at this place. They had a container of black olives in the back that just sat there, and he actually had to hunt around for a fresh can to open. When he looked at the delivery address on the screen, his heart sank a little. It was out in the middle of nowhere. It was actually past the official boundary of their delivery zone. Usually, when an order came in from that far out, Chris would just reject it. It was a habit of his to avoid those long, dark drives. He was getting ready to hit the decline button on the tablet when his manager Russell spoke up. Russell was a guy in his late 30s who did not really do much. He spent 90% of his shift sitting on a plastic crate in the back room, scrolling through Reddit on his phone and letting Chris handle everything. Russell looked over from his phone and told Chris to just take the order. He pointed out that they had not had a single delivery run in over an hour, and they needed the business. Chris did not feel like arguing with him. It was not worth the energy. So he nodded, prepped the pizza, threw it in the oven, and waited. At least the drive would kill about 30 or 40 minutes of his shift, which meant he would be that much closer to going home. When the pizza finally came out of the oven, Chris boxed it up. Russell printed out the receipt with the delivery instructions and stapled it to the top of the cardboard box. Chris grabbed the hot box and was about to walk out the front door to the beat-up delivery car when he finally decided to look closely at the instructions. He had not paid attention to them until that exact moment. Written in the notes section, word for word, were the instructions. They said to park on the street behind the house, walk through the backyard, and knock on the back door only. This caught Chris's attention. It felt a little strange, but he was 17, and his brain immediately started coming up with perfectly logical reasons for why someone would write that. Maybe there was an elderly grandparent sleeping in the front bedroom, and they did not want the headlights or the knocking to wake them up. Maybe they had a loud dog that slept near the front door. Maybe the front porch stairs were broken or being painted. Or maybe it was a teenager trying to sneak food into the house without their parents knowing. It could have been anything, and besides, all Chris could think about was how incredibly slow the night was. If he went back inside to complain or ask questions, he would just end up folding flat cardboard boxes for the next 2 hours. He decided to just do his job and get it over with. But the very second he stepped outside the air-conditioned restaurant, he started having second thoughts. It was one of those thick, oppressive summer nights where the air felt like soup. It was incredibly hot, humid, and completely still. It was like walking into an invisible wall of warm jelly. There was a specific smell in the air too. It was a stale, sour smell that only seemed to happen when the humidity was extremely high and there was no wind. It smelled like sun-baked dirt and old, hot plastic. Chris hated that smell more than anything. He kept his car windows down for about 2 minutes before the heat and the smell became too much to bear, and he rolled them up to blast the low-performing air conditioning. The GPS on his phone showed that the address was in the complete opposite direction of the downtown area. The pizza place was already isolated, but this drive took him even deeper into the rural outskirts. The screen said the drive would take about 25 minutes. It felt a lot longer than that because of how empty the roads were. Chris was not exaggerating when he said the area was desolate. It was not like there were absolutely no houses, but they were spaced very far apart, hidden behind long dirt driveways and thick lines of trees. The further he drove, the darker it got. When he finally approached the destination, he realized the GPS had routed him onto a very narrow, unpaved side street. This street ran directly parallel to a row of backyards. Chris slowed the car down, his headlights cutting through the darkness, and checked the house numbers on his phone. The house he was looking for was completely dark. There were no lights on inside, no cars parked in the dirt driveway, and no porch lights. It looked entirely abandoned. The backyard was a mess. The grass was overgrown, waist-high in some spots, and there was a rickety, sagging wooden fence that was falling apart. The gate was hanging open on a single rusty hinge. Despite how creepy it looked, Chris decided to follow the instructions. He parked on the gravel shoulder of the dirt road, turned off the engine, and grabbed the pizza box. He stepped out into the heavy, humid night air. In one hand, he held the warm pizza box, and in the other, he held a small plastic flashlight. He pointed the beam of light directly down at his feet, so he would not trip over any hidden holes or debris in the tall grass. He walked up the slight incline of the backyard, his sneakers getting damp from the heavy evening dew. As he reached the top of the hill, he saw the back door of the house. It was an old wooden door, painted white but heavily chipped and peeling. There was a small square window pane near the top, but it was covered from the inside by a cheap, dirty curtain. Chris took a deep breath, walked up to the door, and knocked hard. He waited. Nothing happened. He stood there in the dark, listening to the crickets buzzing in the tall grass around him. He knocked a second time, louder this time. He knew that if he went back to the shop with an undelivered pizza, Russell would be furious and might even dock his pay. He did not want to deal with that. He waited another 10 seconds. Still, there was no sound of footsteps, no lights turning on. Chris was just about to raise his hand to knock a third time when he saw the curtain in the small window move. It was not a big movement. It was just a tiny, sudden twitch, like someone had gently run a single finger along the edge of the fabric to peer out. It happened incredibly fast. Chris was staring directly at the glass, so he was absolutely sure he saw it. He stood frozen, expecting the person standing right on the other side of the door to finally turn the lock and open it up. But the door stayed closed. The silence stretched on. And then, before Chris could knock again, he heard the sound of car tires on gravel behind him. He turned around and saw two unmarked, dark-colored cars pull up quickly onto the shoulder right behind his delivery vehicle. They did not have their sirens on, but their headlights were bright, casting long, sharp shadows across the overgrown backyard. Chris's first thought was that he was in trouble. He thought maybe the homeowner had seen a stranger wandering around their backyard with a flashlight and had called the police on him for trespassing. One of the car doors swung open, and a man stepped out into the bright beam of the headlights. Even from his position up by the back door, Chris could tell the man was wearing regular, everyday clothes. He was not in a police uniform. The man raised his hand and motioned for Chris to walk down the hill toward him. Chris assumed this was the homeowner, or maybe the guy who had ordered the pizza and was just getting home from work. He started walking down the grassy slope, holding the pizza box. As he got closer, the man reached into his pocket and pulled something out, holding it up. In the glare of the headlights, Chris saw the metallic glint of a badge. The man was an undercover police officer. As soon as Chris got within about 10 feet of him, the officer spoke in a low, firm voice. He told Chris to get back into his delivery car immediately and wait there. He did not give any explanation. He just repeated the instruction. Chris did not ask any questions. He backed away, opened his door, climbed into the driver's seat of the beat-up sedan, and sat there watching. That was when he realized there were not just two officers. More unmarked cars had quietly pulled up without their lights on. There were at least 5 officers, maybe more, stepping out of the vehicles. None of them were speaking. They all carried heavy tactical flashlights, but they kept them pointed low. They moved with incredible stealth, quickly and quietly circling the perimeter of the dark house. They were clearly trying to avoid being seen or heard by whoever was inside. Not a single officer knocked on the front door or announced their presence. It was a bizarre and intense thing to watch. Chris sat behind the steering wheel, his heart hammering against his ribs. He watched as one of the officers walked up the same grassy hill he had just walked down. The officer reached the back door, put his hand on the brass doorknob, and gently tried to turn it. When the door did not budge, the officer simply turned, gave a silent nod to another man standing in the shadows, and stepped back. It felt like watching a movie, like Chris had stumbled into something he was never supposed to see. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the first officer who had shown his badge walked back down to Chris's car. He crouched down beside the driver's side window. Chris quickly rolled it down. The officer looked at the pizza box sitting on the passenger seat, let out a short, tired sigh, and shook his head. He was very vague about what was actually happening, but he spoke in a calm, polite tone. He explained that there was an active, ongoing investigation involving that specific property. He and his team had been staking the house out for hours. The officer apologized for taking so long to step in, explaining that Chris had pulled up at the exact moment they were repositioning their surveillance vehicles. Chris asked the officer if he wanted to see the delivery order on his phone, and the officer nodded. Chris pulled up the app and showed him the screen. There was a phone number, the address, and the name Jerry, but the officer seemed to already know it was useless. He wrote down the phone number anyway, then looked Chris in the eye and told him he needed to leave the area immediately. Chris was frustrated. He told the officer that his boss was going to be incredibly angry if he brought the pizza back to the shop. The officer just shrugged his shoulders and repeated that Chris had to go. Chris did not have a choice. He started the engine, backed out of the narrow dirt road, and drove away. It took the entire 25-minute drive back to the shop for the reality of the situation to fully sink in. When he was driving, he was just annoyed and confused. But the moment he parked outside the pizza place and stepped out of the car, a wave of cold dread washed over him. He realized that if the police had not arrived when they did, something truly terrible could have happened to him. The only reason the person behind the door had not opened it was likely because they saw the police cars pulling up on the street behind them. But it left Chris with so many unanswered questions. Why would someone order a pizza to a house that was actively being staked out by undercover cops? Did the person inside not know they were being watched? Or did they know, and they used Chris as a tool? Maybe Chris was just a test run, a piece of bait to see if the police would react when someone approached the back door. The tiny movement of the curtain, the dead silence of the house, the strange instructions. It all pointed to something highly calculated and dangerous. Chris never got an explanation. He went back to work. Russell yelled at him for a few minutes about the wasted food, and that was it. Chris eventually moved away, went to college, and forgot about the incident. He probably never would have thought about it again if one of his old high school friends had not brought it up during a conversation a couple of weeks ago. It is probably for the best that he forgets about it again, but he wanted to share the story before that happened. This next story happened just last year. The narrator is now 40 years old. He is a family man, married with 2 young boys, Jordan, who is 7, and Scott, who is 5. He works in the insurance industry, which he readily admits sounds incredibly boring. It is boring, but it provides a stable income and a comfortable life, which is all he really cares about at this stage. A couple of years ago, his father passed away after a long, painful battle with cancer. His father left him a beach house located down in Delaware. The narrator had actually never stayed at the house before, because his father had rented it out to vacationers year-round to help pay for his medical bills. The house was not flashy, and it was not very large, but it was located in a fantastic spot. It was just a single block away from the busy boardwalk, meaning you could walk to the beach in less than 2 minutes. The absolute best feature of the house was a spacious wooden deck on the 2nd floor that gave a beautiful, unobstructed view of the ocean. After his father passed, the family started using the house as their personal getaway. They would go down there every summer, sometimes for a full week, sometimes just for a quick weekend trip. It quickly became their favorite family tradition. While the narrator and his wife loved the relaxing atmosphere, their 2 boys loved it even more. They would spend entire days playing in the sand, riding their bicycles up and down the quiet side streets, and exploring the local shops. The house felt like a wonderful gift, a lasting legacy that his father had left behind for them to enjoy. The events of this story took place during a week-long trip in the middle of July. They had arrived on a Sunday and were planning to stay until Friday. They purposely chose the middle of the week because the heavy weekend crowds would thin out, leaving the beach much quieter and more peaceful. It was a Wednesday night, and the weather had been absolutely perfect all day. The boys were completely exhausted from running around in the sun and sand, and they both knocked out in their beds by around 9:30 in the evening. With the kids asleep, the narrator and his wife went upstairs to the back deck. They were sitting at a small wooden table, playing card games, drinking wine, and listening to the distant sound of the waves crashing on the shore. It was incredibly peaceful. But then, the glass door slid open, and their older son Jordan stepped out onto the deck. He was wearing his pajamas, and he had a very uneasy, disturbed look on his face. He walked over to his father and said that he could not sleep because he kept hearing a strange scratching noise in his bedroom. The narrator looked at his wife, then set his wine glass down on the table. He stood up and told Jordan that he would go downstairs and check it out. He told his wife to stay on the deck and enjoy the quiet. He figured it was just the normal, everyday sounds of an old house. Wooden beach houses are constantly shifting, and it was very common for birds or small mice to get into the attic space. Jordan's room was separate from his younger brother Scott's room, so there was no risk of waking the younger boy. The narrator followed Jordan down the stairs and into his bedroom. Jordan walked over to the far wall near the head of his bed, pointed toward the baseboard, and whispered for his dad to listen closely. They both stood there in the quiet room. At first, the narrator did not hear anything, but he wanted to make sure his son felt safe, so he did not dismiss him. He stood completely still, holding his breath, and listened. After about 20 seconds, he heard it. It was a very faint, dry scratching sound, exactly how Jordan had described it. It was coming from right behind the drywall. The narrator crouched down on the carpet, leaning his head forward until his ear was pressed flat against the wall. He wanted to see if he could locate the exact spot so he could lay down traps the next morning. He figured it was a squirrel or a mouse, but as he kept his ear pressed to the cold wall, the scratching stopped. And then he heard something else. It was not the quick, frantic breathing of a small animal. It was a deep, slow, heavy breath. It was unmistakably human. The sound of air being drawn into a pair of lungs and then slowly exhaled right on the other side of the thin sheet of drywall. The narrator flinched backwards so hard he almost fell over. He let out a sharp gasp, muttering a quiet prayer of shock under his breath. He was frozen in sheer terror. And then, before he could even process what he was hearing, a loud guttural and incredibly angry scream ripped through the wall. It was a raw, animalistic sound that did not even sound human, but it came from right inside the structure of the house. The shock of the sound hit the narrator like a physical blow. A feeling of pure, existential dread washed over him. He did not waste another second. He lunged forward, grabbed Jordan by his arm, and yanked him out of the bedroom. They ran down the short hallway to Scott's room. Scott was still fast asleep, completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding around him. The narrator did not even bother trying to wake him up gently. He just scooped the 5-year-old up in his arms, holding him tightly against his chest, and ran as fast as he could. His only goal was to get his children back upstairs to the deck where his wife was. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he began screaming his wife's name at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with panic. That was when he heard another loud, furious scream behind him. But this time it was not muffled by a wall. It was loud, clear, and incredibly close. He spun his head around as he scrambled up the wooden steps. Down in the hallway he saw a man. The man was covered in thick layers of dirt and filth, his clothes torn and tattered, and he was sprinting down the hallway directly toward the stairs. The narrator almost lost his footing, his knees buckling under the weight of holding both of his sons, but the sheer adrenaline pushed him forward. He burst through the upstairs doorway, ran out onto the back deck, and slammed the heavy sliding glass door shut. Not even 2 seconds after the lock clicked into place, the filthy man threw himself against the glass. He hit the door with incredible force. The narrator genuinely thought the thick glass pane was going to shatter into 1,000 pieces. The man did not stop. He began clawing at the glass with his dirty fingernails, shrieking like a wild animal, pounding his fists against the frame, and screaming horrible, unspeakable things. The narrator threw his entire body weight against the sliding door, holding it shut with everything he had. He turned his head and screamed at his wife to grab the kids and call the police immediately. His wife was terrified, but she acted quickly. She scooped up the crying boys, pulled them into the upper kitchen area, and covered their ears so they would not have to hear the terrifying screams of the man on the deck. The narrator kept his back pressed firmly against the door, staring directly into the wild, unhinged eyes of the man on the other side. He did not want the man to see his family, and he did not want his family to see the monster trying to break in. The man's hands were covered in a mixture of black dirt and what looked like dried blood, and he was smearing it all over the clean glass as he violently rattled the handle. The narrator did not know how long he stood there holding that door shut. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. The man seemed to have an endless supply of frantic energy. He did not slow down or weaken for even a second. It took every ounce of the narrator's physical strength to keep the latch from giving way. He was fully prepared to fight to the death to protect his wife and children if that glass shattered. But just when his muscles were beginning to fail, the bright blue and red lights of police cars illuminated the street below. 2 police officers came running around the side of the house, up the external deck stairs. Within seconds, they burst onto the deck. One of the officers tackled the filthy man from behind, slamming him onto the wooden floorboards, while the second officer moved in to help pin his arms behind his back and secure the handcuffs. The rest of that night was a complete blur of flashing lights, sirens, and police questions. Once the man was locked safely in the back of a patrol car, the officers sat down with the narrator to get his statement. After they finished taking down the details, the 2 officers and the narrator went downstairs to investigate. They wanted to find out how this man had been inside the walls, and how he had managed to get into the hallway so quickly. What they found was truly disturbing. It turned out that the beach house had a hidden crawl space that the narrator had never known existed. There was a small wooden hatch hidden underneath the low-hanging back porch. You would never notice it was there unless you were specifically crawling around in the dirt looking for it. That hatch opened up into a standing tall crawl space that ran alongside the main foundation of the house. From inside that crawl space, there was a second access point. It was a loose wooden panel located at the very back of Jordan's bedroom closet, hidden behind a stack of old blankets. The narrator had never done a thorough inspection of the house when he inherited it, so he had absolutely no idea it was there. A few days later, a detective called the narrator to follow up on the case. He revealed some terrifying details. The man they had arrested was a homeless individual with a history of severe mental illness. He admitted to the police that he had discovered the crawl space during the winter off-season when the house was empty. He had been living inside the walls of the house for months. He had been quietly slipping out of the crawl space when the family was asleep or out at the beach, stealing food from their pantry and eating their leftovers. The family had noticed some food missing, but they had assumed the kids were just waking up in the night to grab snacks. The detective said the man had become deeply angry when the family arrived for their vacation, believing they were intruding on his home. That Wednesday night, he had decided he was going to attack the family. The family never returned to the beach house for the rest of that summer. It was not because they thought someone else was there, but because the trauma of the event was too much to handle. The narrator hired a professional contractor to completely fill in the crawl space with concrete and permanently seal every single access point. Once that was done, he felt a little better. They finally went back to the house this summer, and while the memory still haunts them, things are slowly getting back to normal. Our final story today takes us back to when the narrator was 16 years old, growing up in a very rural part of the country. It was the kind of area where you could ride your bicycle for miles down empty dirt roads without seeing another living soul. For her, summer was always the absolute best time of the year. She loved the warmth, the quiet, and the sheer emptiness of the countryside. It was a feeling of freedom that you could never find in a crowded city. She felt like she had her own private corner of the world, where she could disappear for hours at a time, and nobody would ever know where she was. The summer nights were especially magical. The darkness made everything feel incredibly private and peaceful. During that summer, her best friend was a girl named Taylor. Taylor was a bit of a rebel. She was reckless, always wanting to push the boundaries and do things they were not supposed to do. One hot night in July, the two girls decided they wanted to go stargazing. They sneaked out of their houses with their bicycles, a blanket, and a bottle of cheap red wine that Taylor had managed to swipe. This was not an unusual thing for them to do. They did it all the time. But this night would end up being the very last time they ever went stargazing together. They did not have a specific destination in mind when they started pedaling. They just wanted to go somewhere new, since their usual spots were starting to feel a little boring. Taylor said she knew of a great spot just past the outer limits of their town. It was an abandoned stretch of old farmland where nobody would ever come to bother them. It was around 10 o'clock at night when they left. They rode their bikes in silence for about 30 minutes, passing the last few houses and streetlights, until there was absolutely nothing left but open fields and darkness. Suddenly, Taylor slammed on her brakes and announced that they had arrived. The narrator looked around. There were no trees, no fences, no signs of life. It was just a massive empty field of wild grass stretching out under an enormous starry sky. It was beautiful. They spread their blanket out on the grass, and Taylor pulled a small corkscrew from her pocket to open the wine. The wine tasted awful, but they did not care. They laid side by side on the blanket, passing the bottle back and forth, looking up at the sky and trying to name the different constellations they recognized. Their main goal on nights like this was always to spot a shooting star. At one point, Taylor asked if she thought they would actually see one, and the narrator told her to just keep watching. The stars were incredibly bright out there because there was no light pollution from the city. As the night went on, the wine started to take effect. The narrator felt a warm, pleasant fuzziness spreading through her body. It was one of those nights where time seemed to completely lose its meaning. There was a brief, strange moment that stood out in her memory. They were laying close together, and Taylor looked over at her with an expression that made the narrator wonder if Taylor wanted to be more than just friends. Growing up in a very conservative rural town, that kind of topic was never talked about openly. The narrator had always suspected Taylor might have feelings for her, but she had never brought it up. In that brief moment, the feeling was stronger than ever, but neither of them said anything. They just laughed off the quiet tension, and right then, a bright shooting star streaked across the dark sky. It was a beautiful sight, and they both let out a loud gasp of excitement. Taylor told her to make a wish. The narrator closed her eyes to think of a wish, letting the cool night breeze brush against her face. She felt completely peaceful, settling deep into the soft grass. She was absolutely certain that her eyes were not closed for more than 5 seconds. But when she opened them, the field was dead silent. She turned her head to look at Taylor, but Taylor was gone. She was not laying on the blanket. She was not standing nearby. The narrator sat up quickly, her heart skipping a beat. She looked around, squinting into the darkness. Taylor's bicycle, which had been laying on the ground right next to the blanket, was gone too. Only the narrator's bike remained. The narrator stood up, her mind racing. She thought Taylor was just playing a cruel joke on her, hiding in the tall grass to scare her, but as she spun around in a full circle, she realized how dark and cold the field had suddenly become. The stars above looked incredibly dim, as if someone had turned down the brightness of the sky or smeared a dark film over the heavens. The air felt freezing, a sharp contrast to the warm summer night they had been enjoying just seconds before. The entire atmosphere felt completely different, like she had stepped into a different dimension of the exact same place. She pulled her phone out of her pocket to check the time. The glowing screen read exactly 3:30 in the morning. The narrator stared at the numbers in absolute disbelief. It had only been around 11 o'clock when they saw the shooting star. There was no possible way she had been asleep for over 4 hours. She did not feel tired, and she had no memory of falling asleep. Her mind was completely sharp. She began screaming Taylor's name into the empty darkness, her voice trembling with panic. There was no response. She tried calling Taylor's phone, but the calls went straight to voicemail. Tears began streaming down her face. She was terrified, alone in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night. She scrambled onto her bicycle and began pedaling back toward town as fast as her legs could carry her. That ride was the most terrifying experience of her life. Every shadow looked like a monster, and the empty road felt endless. When she finally reached her house, she ran inside, locked the door, and fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, she woke up and immediately grabbed her phone to text Taylor. She was angry and wanted an explanation for why Taylor had abandoned her in the field. But before she could type a message, she saw a text from Taylor that had been sent earlier that morning. The text said, "Where the hell did you go last night?" The narrator was completely confused. She called Taylor immediately, and they spent the next hour trying to figure out what had happened. Taylor swore on her life that she was the one who had been left behind. According to Taylor, they had been laying on the blanket when the narrator suddenly stood up, grabbed her bike, and walked away without saying a word. Taylor said she had called out to her, but the narrator just ignored her and disappeared into the darkness. Taylor claimed she had waited on the blanket for over an hour, crying and calling her phone, before finally riding home alone at 3 in the morning, furious that her best friend had ditched her. But the narrator knew that was impossible. She had been the one who woke up alone. What made the situation even more terrifying was their phone records. Both girls remembered calling each other multiple times during their panic, but when they checked their call logs, there were absolutely no records of any outgoing or incoming calls between them from that night. It was as if those hours had simply been erased from reality. They could not find a single logical explanation for what had happened. They eventually stopped talking about it because it was too deeply unsettling. Their friendship was never quite the same after that night. They slowly drifted apart, and they haven't spoken in years. But the narrator still lies awake some nights, looking up at the stars and wondering what truly happened to them in that empty field. These stories show us that the world is full of dark, hidden corners, and sometimes we stumble into them when we least expect it. Whether it is a dark house at the end of a dirt road, a silent space behind the walls of our own home, or a quiet field under a cold sky, there are things out there that we may never fully understand. All we can do is hold on to the people we love, keep our doors locked, and hope that the shadows do not decide to follow us home. The world is much bigger and far stranger than we like to admit, and sometimes the worst monsters are the ones that wait in the places where we feel the safest. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, See ya. It was a rainy Saturday night, and a young woman was out at a busy downtown club with her boyfriend. They had been arguing for a very long time, and tonight was no different. Fed up with the constant fighting, she decided she did not want to be there anymore. She walked out into the pouring rain and called an Uber. Because of the downpour, she stood under a small building awning nearby to stay dry. A white car pulled up in front of her and came to a stop. She walked over, and the woman driving rolled down the window. The young woman asked if she was her Uber, and when the driver said yes, she asked for her name. The driver agreed, so the young woman got into the back seat. She asked the driver how she was doing, but the woman did not answer. When she did not hear a response, the young woman looked up from her phone. She noticed the woman had both hands firmly planted on the steering wheel, sitting in an incredibly stiff, upright position. She also had very curly hair and a dark skin complexion. The car drove down the street she usually took, but then it made a turn and headed in the exact opposite direction. She did not want to correct her immediately, thinking maybe she was taking a different route to avoid traffic. But as they got further away, her anxiety grew. She finally spoke up and told her she was going the wrong way. The driver replied in a thick, hard-to-understand accent that she was taking the highway instead. The young woman knew the highway was not a quicker route. Suddenly, her phone vibrated. She looked down and saw a notification from Uber saying, "Meet your driver now." She opened the app and saw her actual Uber had just arrived, and it was a black Nissan, not this white car. Panic set in. She began shouting at the driver that she was not her Uber and demanded to be let out. When the driver ignored her, she started yelling and pushing at the front seat. She tried to open the door, but the child's safety lock was on. After more frantic screaming, the driver finally looked in the rearview mirror, pulled over, and unlocked the doors. The young woman ran out into the rain. Her actual Uber driver called, and she got in his car, explaining everything. He stopped the car and told her she had just escaped a known sex trafficking trap. He explained that multiple fake Ubers, often driven by women to appear less intimidating, had been active in the area trying to lure victims. She realized how close she had come to disappearing. It was a terrifying reminder of how a single careless mistake on a dark, rainy night could have cost her her life. One night, after leaving a local bar, a young man was decently drunk and started messaging people on Tinder. A girl named Alicia messaged him back almost immediately, asking what he was doing. He replied that he was looking to hang out, and she invited him over to smoke, promptly sending her address. It seemed like the perfect, easiest match a guy could ask for. He called an Uber and got in the front seat since he was feeling talkative. The driver was a really cool guy, and they laughed as the young man explained he was on his way to meet a Tinder date. On the way, he texted Alicia, and her replies seemed completely normal. However, when they arrived, the driver remarked that the dark, empty house looked familiar and sketchy. There were no cars in the driveway, and all the lights were off. He warned the passenger to be careful. The young man got out, and the driver pulled down the block to wait. Walking up to the dark house, the young man tried the doorbell, but it did not work. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He tried calling Alicia, but the phone went straight to voicemail after one ring. Right after, she texted him, saying the door was open and to come inside. Just then, a sudden knock on the window made his heart stop. He looked and saw the blinds lift slightly, and a hand waving from the darkness inside. Before he could open the door, his phone rang from an unknown number. He answered, but instead of Alicia, it was his Uber driver, ordering him in a panicked voice to walk away immediately. The driver pulled back up to the house and told him to get in. As they sped away, the driver explained that the house was vacant, and just the previous month, someone had been lured there, robbed, and murdered. The driver had recognized the address from the news. The young man realized he had almost walked into a deadly trap, and he could not thank the driver enough. The next morning, when he was completely sober, the reality of how close he had come to being murdered was incredibly disturbing to think about, and he realized how lucky he was to have had such a vigilant driver who cared enough to stay and make sure he was safe. It was a quiet Monday night, which is usually a very slow night for rideshare drivers. So when a ride request popped up on his screen, the driver jumped on it. The passenger's name was listed as John. He drove across the neighborhood to a corner liquor store that was completely closed at this hour. There were two young men waiting on the corner, and when he pulled up, they got into the back seat. He confirmed the name John to make sure he had the right passenger, and then he started driving toward their destination. But he immediately felt uneasy. The two passengers whispered to each other constantly, and it was very odd. Every time he looked in the rearview mirror, they would notice and stare directly back at him. He tried to ignore them, but he found himself looking back over and over again. He asked them where they were heading, but neither of them answered. He figured they didn't hear him because the back window was open and the wind noise was loud, so he asked again. This time, one of them yelled out, "Harris Avenue." The aggressive tone made it clear they didn't want to talk. The driver felt his anxiety rising, and his foot instinctively pressed a bit harder on the gas pedal, wanting to get them to their destination as fast as possible. When they finally reached the street, he pulled up to a rundown storefront where a group of men were standing. As he turned around to ask if this was the spot, his heart dropped. Both passengers had pulled creepy masks over their faces, similar to the masks from the movie The Purge. Suddenly, he felt something hard and cold press against the back of his shoulder. He assumed it was a gun. They ordered him to pull up closer to the men outside. He did as he was told, and three large men wearing the same masks approached his window, demanding his wallet. He handed it over immediately. The passengers got out, and all five masked men walked away, with one of them kicking his car door. The driver quickly sped off and reported the incident. It turned out the account info was fake and paid for with a stolen card. He lost $250, his ID, and his cards, but he was incredibly grateful to escape with his life and move on from that terrible night. After leaving a friend's lively Super Bowl party, a young man called an Uber to drive him home. When he opened the door and got in, there was already a guy wearing a baseball hat sitting in the back seat. The young man didn't say anything to acknowledge him, only saying a quick hello to the driver. He figured he must have accidentally called an Uber pool instead of a regular ride, so he didn't care. When they arrived at his house, the young man got out of the car and shut the door. But as the car started to drive away, he heard a second door slam on the other side. He stopped and saw the guy in the baseball hat standing in the street, facing his direction with his head down, so his hat completely covered his face. The young man asked what was going on, but the stranger didn't answer and just slowly started to walk away. Knowing something was wrong, the young man decided to walk around the block instead of going inside his house. He looked across the street and realized the stranger had crossed over and was walking in the same direction, matching his exact pace. When the young man reached the intersection and turned the corner, the stranger did the same thing. Suddenly, the stranger started to run. The young man's adrenaline kicked in, and he sprinted faster than he ever had in his life. Fortunately, he was faster and managed to put some distance between them. He ran to his backyard and hid in the darkness before the man could see where he went, then slipped inside his house. He immediately called the Uber driver to ask about the other passenger. The driver explained that the guy in the hat had claimed he personally knew the next passenger, which was why the driver allowed him to stay. The driver said he had the man's information and would report him, but the young man never found out what happened next. It was a terrifying experience that taught him to always be extremely cautious with his ride-share trips and never let his guard down when arriving home late at night. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. It was late October when Tyler and his girlfriend Stacy decided they needed a weekend getaway to escape their stressful daily routines. They wanted to see the autumn foliage in Vermont, so they booked a cozy hilltop cabin in Stowe through Glamping Hub. They had been working extra hours, and this trip was meant to help them unwind. They had the rental from Thursday night until Sunday, looking forward to a quiet weekend. When they arrived late on Thursday evening, the surrounding woods were pitch black. The cabin had a keyless entry system. The owner had sent Tyler the code beforehand, and it worked perfectly. Stepping inside, they found the place warm and inviting. Everything was made of wood, giving it an old-fashioned country feel and a distinct wood smell. It had a bathroom, a small kitchen, 3 bedrooms, and a living room. There were 2 televisions, but they noticed that one of the bedroom doors was locked. The listing had mentioned 3 bedrooms, so they were not sure why this one was sealed off. However, they assumed the owner had some personal belongings stored in there. To keep the master bedroom neat, they placed most of their luggage in the second bedroom. Since they arrived late, they went straight out to dinner in town, walked around the village for a bit, and then returned to watch a movie before calling it a night. The next day was cloudy and chilly. They went out to hike along some dirt trails in the woods near the cabin. Upon returning, Tyler took a hot shower and changed. When he got out, Stacy told him she had heard a strange noise in the bedroom with the locked door, like a radio or a low voice recording. Tyler went up to the door and pressed his ear against it, but it was silent. He knocked on the door to tease Stacy, which made her nervous. She told him to stop because the idea of someone being in there freaked her out. While Stacy was taking her shower, Tyler sat in the living room. That was when he heard a very slight sound coming from inside the locked room. He muted the television and pressed his ear against the door. He definitely heard a faint speaking noise, like a radio playing at a low volume. He messaged and then called the host to report the issue. The host was confused and said he was not sure why the door would be locked, but his wife might have left some of her things in there. Tyler and Stacy went out for lunch at Harrison's on Main Street. He did not tell her about the noise he heard because he did not want to ruin her day. While they were relaxing at a park later, the host called back. He said his wife confirmed she did not lock the door and had no idea what they could be hearing. He offered to come by and unlock it to check. Tyler agreed, and they headed back to the cabin. When they returned, Stacy collapsed on the couch, exhausted. Tyler went to the locked door and heard the same radio sounds again. Suddenly, he had an idea. He walked outside and went over to the window of the locked bedroom. There were no curtains blocking the view. Standing on his tiptoes, Tyler looked inside and was horrified. He saw a tall, extremely thin young man in a dark hood dancing slowly in the center of the room. He was holding a small radio in his hand. The stranger noticed Tyler at the window, stopped dancing, and stared back with a wide, terrifying smile. Tyler began screaming for Stacy to get out of the house. He grabbed their bags, threw them in the car, and drove off in a panic. He called the host and told him to contact the police. An hour later, the host called back to say the police had searched the cabin. The strange man was gone, but they found multiple empty bags of potato chips under the bed. The intruder had been living in that locked room the entire time Tyler and Stacy were there, listening to them sleep. They spent the rest of the trip at a nearby motel, but Tyler could not forget that smiling, dancing figure. Our next story takes us to a dark, rainy Friday night in the middle of October. A young man named Jake was driving home late after attending a Halloween housewarming party. Jake worked long, erratic hours as a nurse at a hospital, so his sleep schedule was always ruined. By the time he arrived at the party, he was already exhausted from a grueling 12-hour shift. To keep himself awake, he had taken an Adderall before leaving his apartment and had stopped at a gas station to buy drinks. There were about 30 people packed into the small house, and Jake spent most of the night trying to make polite conversation. But as the hours wore on, the deep exhaustion made him desperately want to go home to bed. Eventually, Jake decided to do an Irish goodbye, quietly slipping out through the back door to avoid saying goodbye to everyone. He ran through the heavy rain, climbed into his Subaru, and started the engine. He did not turn on any music, preferring the quiet peace of the rain hitting the windshield as he drove down the slick roads. As he was driving down a quiet residential street, his headlights caught the figure of a young girl walking alone in the pouring rain. She had an umbrella, no raincoat, and was completely drenched. As Jake drew closer, the girl stopped walking and turned to look directly at his car. Jake debated whether to pull over. Ultimately, his compassionate side won. He pulled his Subaru over to the curb, rolled down his window, and asked if she needed a ride. Without saying a single word, the girl opened the door and climbed into the back seat. A sudden draft of cold air filled the car as she shut the door. Jake looked at her through his rearview mirror and asked where she was heading. She spoke in a quiet voice, telling him that she just needed to go to the end of this road. Jake nodded, put the car in drive, and continued down the street. As he stopped at a second stop sign, Jake tried to make light conversation. He asked her why she was out walking in such a terrible storm without a jacket. She replied that she was just in a hurry to get back, and did not want to wait around for an expensive cab. Jake made a quick joke about how overpriced rideshares had become these days. He introduced himself as Jake. The girl quietly replied that her name was Ali, and she thanked him for picking her up. After that, no more words were exchanged. The car fell silent except for the sound of the windshield wipers. Jake looked up at the rearview mirror once more and noticed that Ali was staring straight ahead, her eyes looking completely distant. He continued driving down the street until he noticed a dead-end sign. He brought the car to a stop near the sign and asked Ali if her destination was past the dead end. He did not get an answer. Jake looked up at his rearview mirror, expecting to see her sitting in the back seat, but the reflection showed nothing but empty space. His heart stopped. He slammed his foot on the brake, threw the car into park, and turned his head completely around. The back seat was completely empty. Panicking, Jake pulled the car over and turned on the interior light. He jumped out into the pouring rain, opened the rear door, and searched the entire back row. There was absolutely nobody there. He looked up and down the empty road, but there was not a single soul in sight. He had never heard the car door open or close, which was impossible because his Subaru doors made a very loud click when opened. Then, Jake touched the fabric of the seat where Ali had been sitting. The seat should have been soaked, but there was not a single drop of water on the fabric. Jake stood there in the pouring rain, his mind racing. He looked to the right of his parked car, just beyond a low metal fence, and saw the dark iron gates of an old, quiet cemetery. The girl's words echoed in his mind. She had asked to go to the end of this road, and the end of this road was the cemetery. Terrified, Jake scrambled back into his car, locked the doors, turned the heater on, and sped away as fast as his car would go. He spent the rest of the night shivering in his bed, unable to forget the girl who had vanished. Our final story takes place in Oak Hill, Ohio, during a chilly weekend in mid-October. A group of close friends named Joe, Carl, Cody, and the narrator had a long-standing tradition of visiting haunted attractions every Halloween. That year, they decided to check out a highly rated haunted corn maze. The drive to Oak Hill was quiet, with the dark highway stretched out before them and the cold autumn wind blowing dry leaves across the road. When they finally pulled into the dirt parking lot, they could see the bright floodlights from a distance, surrounded by cars. The air smelled of roasted nuts, mixed with the sound of laughter and distant screams echoing from deep within the cornfield. While waiting in line, they overheard some kids saying how the maze had to shut down the previous year because an actor had actually hurt a customer. The rumor was that an actor in a costume had pushed a visitor, causing them to close for the night. This news added to their nerves, making them feel like the actors here might go above and beyond typical jump scares. Once inside, the maze felt like a normal attraction. Tall corn stalks towered over them, and actors occasionally jumped out to startle them. Speakers blasted spooky sound effects, and Halloween decorations were scattered everywhere. Eventually, they came to a split in the path, with a sign pointing left for safety and right for danger. They decided to split up, with Cody and the narrator taking the left safety path. They expected this path to actually be the scarier one, designed to trick visitors. As they walked, the tall cornstalks blocked out almost all of the ambient light, casting long shadows across the narrow path. The ground was cold and muddy, making their footsteps sound heavy and wet as they moved deeper into the dark, rustling crops. They turned a dark corner and saw an actor standing completely still. The person wore an all-black outfit with a blank white pullover mask that had only 2 eye holes and no mouth or nose. The figure held a pumpkin and slowly walked toward them, gesturing for them to take it. As they drew closer, they noticed the white mask was slightly dirty, with crude stitching around the eye holes. The eyes staring out from behind the fabric looked completely cold and unblinking, making the encounter even more uncomfortable. He spoke in a deep, raspy, disguised voice, whispering for them to take it. They laughed and tried to walk past, but the masked figure stepped into their path, blocking them. He began to follow them closely, repeating the same words over and over. He kept insisting that they take the pumpkin. The joke was starting to feel old, but the man continued to stalk them down the path for over a minute, his tone becoming increasingly aggressive. Finally, the man stopped, glared through his hollow eye holes, and growled that if they did not take it, he would kill them. The narrator did not take the threat seriously in a public attraction, but he wanted the encounter to end, so he took the heavy pumpkin from the man's hands. The pumpkin felt surprisingly heavy and cold in his hands, and a faint, sweet smell of rotting fruit seemed to drift from the top, which was damp to the touch. The masked figure immediately stopped moving, allowing them to walk away. A few minutes later, they reunited with Joe and Carl at the exit path. The friends laughed when they saw the narrator carrying a real pumpkin. As they walked toward the exit, another actor dressed in a zombie costume broke character and approached them. He pointed at the pumpkin and told them visitors were not allowed to take props. The narrator explained that the actor in the white mask had given it to him. The zombie actor looked confused and asked where they had met this person. When the narrator pointed back to the left path, the actor quickly walked away to investigate. When they reached the bright lights of the main exit, the narrator noticed the top of the pumpkin was sliced open. Curious, he grabbed the stem and lifted the lid, expecting a silly prop or candy inside. But what he saw made his stomach turn. Lying at the bottom of the pumpkin was a pile of small, fleshy objects. When the narrator reached in and picked one up, his heart stopped. It was a real, severed human finger. There were about 9 other human fingers resting at the bottom. Drawn in black marker on the orange skin of the pumpkin was a pair of eyes and the words, "Always watching," with a smiley face. The group screamed in terror and ran to a young girl working the ticket booth. She called her supervisor, and within minutes, the police arrived and shut the entire corn maze down. Several police cruisers rolled into the parking lot, with their blue lights flashing, casting shadows across the dark fields. The officers spoke in serious tones as they stretched yellow crime scene tape across the main entrance. The police questioned the boys and took the pumpkin for forensic testing. They searched the massive cornfield with dogs, but because the attraction was in a remote area, the mysterious man in the blank mask was never found. To this day, they do not know who the man in the mask was, or whose fingers they had been carrying through that dark maze. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Back in the year 2014, my life was in a bit of a transition phase, mostly because of a really stupid mistake I had made. I had recently been charged with a DUI, which meant I lost my driver's license for a solid 12 months. It was an incredibly frustrating and sobering experience, but I had no one to blame but myself. Since I could not drive, I found myself relying heavily on a relatively new app at the time called Uber. It was my lifeline for getting to work, buying groceries, and occasionally going out on weekends. In my town, there was this popular nightclub and bar where my friends and I would always gather. On most weekends, we would head out there to unwind. If we were lucky, one of us would act as the designated driver, but more often than not, we would just end up catching an Uber back home. On this particular night, however, things did not go according to our usual plan. I had arrived at the club with my friends, but by the time midnight rolled around, I started feeling pretty unwell. My stomach was upset, and the loud music and flashing lights were just making me feel worse. I decided to head home early, leaving my friends behind to keep partying. It was somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning when I walked out of the club. The air outside was absolutely freezing, the kind of deep winter cold that bites right through your jacket and makes your teeth chatter. Walking home was completely out of the question because I lived several miles away. I pulled out my phone with shivering fingers and opened up the Uber app to request a ride. Almost immediately, a driver named Alex popped up on my screen. He was only about 2 miles away, which meant I wouldn't have to wait long in the freezing cold. I tapped on his profile to check his details, and I have to admit, his picture made me feel a little uneasy. He looked older, maybe in his late 50s, and he had this very stern, unsmiling expression. He wore a black beanie cap pulled low over his forehead, and he had a thick, grayish goatee. He looked pretty creepy, but I brushed the feeling off. I told myself I was just being paranoid because I was tired and sick. Besides, the app showed he drove a Chevy Malibu, which sounded like a decent, reliable car. I requested the ride and stood on the sidewalk to wait. To stay out of the biting wind, I sat down on a concrete bench right next to the club's entrance. The bouncer was standing right beside me, completely still like a stone statue with his hands folded in front of him. We didn't talk, both of us just staring out into the dark. quiet street. About 5 minutes later, a silver car pulled up to the curb. My heart sank a little bit when I saw it. This was not the nice, modern Chevy Malibu I had pictured. It was an old, beat-up model, probably from around 2003. The paint was faded, the bumper was dented, and it just looked incredibly ratty. The driver didn't flash his headlights, he didn't honk his horn, and he didn't call out my name. He just sat there idling by the curb, waiting. I stood up, said a quick goodbye to the silent bouncer, and walked over to the car. I opened the rear door and climbed into the back seat. Immediately, the atmosphere inside the car felt incredibly heavy and uncomfortable. The driver, Alex, didn't turn around to greet me. He didn't say hello, he didn't ask how my night was going, and he didn't even look at me through the rearview mirror. He just stared straight ahead through the windshield. After a few seconds of dead silence, he spoke in a very low, quiet voice. He simply asked, "Where you headed to?" I gave him my home address, and he put the car in drive, pulling away from the curb. We started driving down Main Street, but within a minute, I realized we were heading in the completely wrong direction. My house was to the south, but he was driving north. I cleared my throat and told him that he was going the wrong way. Without saying a word, he turned left at the next intersection. But instead of getting back on the main roads that would lead to my house, he started navigating through quiet, dark residential areas. I watched him closely and noticed that he didn't have his phone mounted on the dashboard. In fact, he wasn't using any GPS at all. This made me feel extremely strange. I couldn't tell if he expected me to give him turn-by-turn directions, or if he had something else in mind. To ease my anxiety, I pulled out my own phone, opened up my map app, and entered my home address. I turned the volume up all the way so the GPS voice would speak loudly, hoping he would follow the instructions. As we approached the next street, the GPS voice clearly instructed to turn left, but Alex completely ignored it and drove straight past the intersection. I made a confused hand gesture in the back seat, hoping he would see me in his mirror. He did notice. He glanced back quickly and said, "I just have to make a quick stop, don't worry. I will give you a discount on the ride." Even though I had been drinking earlier, the sudden rush of adrenaline completely cleared my mind. I knew right then that something was terribly wrong. That was the exact moment my eyes drifted down to the center console. Right next to his seat, sticking out of the open middle glove box, was the black grip of a handgun. My heart stopped. I stared at the weapon, my mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. I needed to get out of this car immediately. We were approaching a red light, and I realized this might be my only chance. I waited until the car came to a complete stop. Very slowly and quietly, I reached my hand down and gripped the door handle. The handle moved smoothly, but the door itself remained firmly shut, completely sealed against the frame. I tried again, pushing my shoulder hard against the door panel, but it wouldn't budge. My stomach dropped as the chilling realization hit me. The child lock on the rear passenger door was fully engaged, and I was completely trapped. At this point, pure panic set in. My heart was pounding so hard I was worried he would hear it. Alex kept driving, taking us further and further away from my home. By my estimation, we had crossed into the next town, and then the town after that. We were in a completely unfamiliar area, surrounded by dark roads and empty buildings. I couldn't pull out my phone to call the police because I was terrified of how he would react if he saw me dialing 911. He had a gun right next to him, and I was trapped in the back seat. I had to figure out a way to unlock that door myself. I knew that the controls for the child locks on older cars were usually located on the driver's door panel or the center console. I realized my only option was to slide across the back seat and position myself directly behind him. If I could get close enough, I might be able to reach forward and flick the lock switch when he wasn't looking. This was easily the most terrifying moment of my life. I stared intensely at the back of his head, watching his reflection in the rearview mirror. I waited until his eyes were focused on the road ahead. Then, as gently and silently as possible, I slid my body across the leather seat until I was sitting directly behind him. He didn't seem to notice. I waited for the next red light, knowing I had to time my move perfectly. We drove for several more minutes, the tension building inside me, until I felt like I was going to throw up. Finally, the light ahead turned yellow, and Alex began to slow the car down. We stopped at a relatively large intersection. It was late, but there was another car stopped on the opposite side of the road, which gave me a tiny sliver of hope. I took a deep breath, gathered every ounce of courage I had, and lunged forward. I reached my arm over the front seat and slammed my finger onto the glowing door lock button on his panel. The sudden movement startled him completely. Alex literally jumped 2 inches out of his seat and let out a loud, angry scream. Just as I had feared, his hand immediately reached down toward the glove box where the gun was resting. But I didn't hesitate. The moment I heard the click of the locks opening, I grabbed my door handle, threw the door open, and scrambled out of the car. I stumbled onto the cold asphalt, my legs shaking violently. I ran as fast as I could toward the other car at the intersection, a large Cadillac Escalade. I began banging desperately on their passenger window, screaming for help. To my absolute horror, the driver of the Escalade looked at me with a face full of fear, hit the gas, and sped away, leaving me stranded in the middle of the dark intersection. I spun around, expecting Alex to be right behind me with the gun. But to my surprise, he had decided not to pursue me. He had floored the Malibu and was already speeding away down the block, his taillights disappearing into the darkness. I ran to a nearby 24-hour grocery store, my heart still hammering in my chest. I walked inside, shivering uncontrollably under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights. The cashier gave me a strange, concerned look, probably because I was pale, gasping for breath, and looked like I had just seen a ghost. I stood near the entrance, trying to stop my hands from shaking, and called a traditional taxi service to pick me up and take me home. The sheer terror of the situation had completely sobered me up. When I got home, I immediately reported the incident to Uber. They took my statement and told me they would escalate the situation to the police. However, it took a full week before an officer finally showed up at my house to ask me a few basic questions. I never found out what happened to Alex, or if he was ever arrested. All I know is that I uninstalled the app that very night, and I have never stepped foot inside an Uber since. But dangerous encounters on rideshare apps don't just happen to passengers. Sometimes, the person behind the wheel is the one who ends up fighting for their life. A few years after my experience, an 18-year-old named Marcus was working as an Uber driver in a different part of the country. Marcus was a skinny kid, and his parents had recently bought him a brand new Honda Accord. Because Marcus was so young and physically small, his father was constantly worried about his safety. Before Marcus started driving for Uber, his dad handed him a small pocket knife and told him to keep it in the side compartment of his seat. His dad had heard too many local news stories about rideshare drivers getting set up, robbed, or worse in the middle of the night. He wanted Marcus to have some form of defense, even if it was small. Marcus didn't really think he would ever actually need to use it, but he kept the blade hidden away there anyway, just to give his dad some peace of mind. It was a freezing Friday night in December, easily one of the coldest nights of the winter. Marcus was bored and decided to log onto the app to make some extra money doing late-night pickups. Around midnight, a request came in from a user named Tom. The pickup location was only a couple of miles away, situated near a major shopping center. Marcus accepted the ride and drove over. When he arrived, he saw a group of rowdy teenagers hanging out near the entrance of the shopping center. They looked like they were looking for trouble, and Marcus prayed that his passenger wasn't one of them. He drove slowly past them, feeling their eyes on his brand new car. Wanting to avoid any conflict, Marcus drove further into the empty parking lot, away from the teenagers. He did 2 slow laps around the dark shopping center, looking for anyone who might be his passenger. Finally, as he checked his left side mirror, he saw a lone figure walking quickly toward his car from behind. Marcus rolled down his window and called out the name Tom. The man stopped and called back, "Yes." Marcus unlocked the doors and told him to hop in, but the man just stood there looking confused. Marcus had to repeat himself 3 times, speaking loudly and clearly, before the man finally understood and walked around to the passenger side, instead of sitting in the front or diagonally in the back, which is what most passengers did. Tom opened the rear door and climbed into the seat directly behind Marcus. This immediately made Marcus incredibly uncomfortable. Having a complete stranger sit directly behind your head makes it impossible to keep an eye on them. As soon as Tom closed the door, the small space inside the Honda Accord filled with the heavy, stale smell of cigarette smoke. Marcus looked at him in the mirror. Tom looked to be in his late 40s, with a rough, weathered face. Marcus asked him for his destination, and Tom mumbled an address. Marcus entered it into his phone. It was a 10-mile drive, which meant a good payout, but Marcus already had a bad feeling about this guy. Marcus tried to start some friendly small talk to ease the tension, but Tom was completely unresponsive. Whenever Marcus asked a simple question, Tom would either mumble incoherently or just remain completely silent. After a few minutes of getting nothing but cold, dry responses, Marcus gave up and stopped talking. The silence in the car became deafening. By the time they reached the 6-mile mark, Marcus felt a heavy sense of dread settling in his stomach. He was terrified to look in his rearview mirror because he was certain Tom was staring at him. He finally mustered the courage to take a quick glance. He was right. Tom was sitting perfectly still, his eyes locked onto the back of Marcus's neck. Marcus's body reacted instantly to the fear. His foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, wanting to speed up and get this ride over with as fast as possible. By the 8th mile, the surroundings changed drastically. They had left the populated areas behind, and were now driving through a completely deserted stretch of road. There was nothing but thick, dark woods on either side of the asphalt, with only the occasional abandoned building passing by. Marcus looked down at his phone map to see where this address actually was. He dragged his finger across the screen and realized with a jolt of panic that the destination was at the very end of a dead-end street, miles away from any main roads. With his heart hammering against his ribs, Marcus decided to ask Tom if this address was actually his house. He waited in the quiet car, but there was no response. 5 seconds passed in complete silence. Finally, Tom answered in a flat, chilling voice, "Yes." They were less than a mile away now, surrounded by pitch-black woods. Marcus approached the turn for the dead-end street and slowed down, shining his headlights into the darkness. There were no streetlights, no houses, and no signs of life. It was just a black void. Marcus knew that if he drove down that road, he would be completely isolated. He made a split-second decision to pretend he had missed the turn, hoping to keep driving toward a safer area. But the moment he passed the street, Tom sat forward and yelled at him to turn around. The aggression in Tom's voice made Marcus realize his life was in serious danger. He apologized, made a quick 3-point turn, and headed back toward the dead-end road. As he turned the car onto the dark street, Marcus quietly slipped his right hand into the netting compartment on the side of his seat. His fingers wrapped around the handle of his father's pocket knife. He quietly flicked the blade open, holding it tightly in his grip, hidden from view. He drove to the very end of the road where the headlights revealed nothing but a wall of thick trees. The car came to a stop. Marcus held his breath, waiting for whatever was about to happen. Tom spoke up, his voice suddenly shifting to a soft, almost polite tone. He thanked Marcus for the ride and opened his door, but instead of stepping out, Tom paused. He looked at Marcus and asked if he could get out of the car to help him carry his bag, claiming he had a bad back. But Marcus knew for a fact that Tom didn't have a bag. He had got into the car with absolutely nothing. Marcus tried to keep his voice steady, telling Tom that he would be right out to help him, but the trembling in his voice was undeniable. Before Marcus could even put the car in park, he felt a sudden violent pressure wrap around his throat. Tom had lunged forward from the back seat, wrapping his thick arms around Marcus's neck, cutting off his airway. Marcus couldn't breathe. Instinct took over. Without a second thought, Marcus brought his right hand up and drove the open blade of the knife directly into Tom's left arm. Tom let out a horrific scream of pain and instantly released his grip on Marcus's neck. He scrambled backward, threw the door open, and fell out of the car onto the cold pavement. Marcus didn't waste a single second. He slammed his foot onto the gas pedal, spinning the steering wheel, and floored it back down the dark, dead-end road. He didn't stop driving until he reached a brightly lit, busy highway. Marcus was so terrified and traumatized by the attack that he didn't even call the police. He just drove straight home, locked his doors, and tried to sleep. The very next day, Marcus officially resigned as an Uber driver, never wanting to risk his life behind the wheel for a stranger ever again. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Imagine driving down a dark highway in the middle of the night. You are surrounded by nothing but towering trees and endless asphalt stretching out ahead. Most of us think of rest areas as safe havens, places to stretch our legs, grab a quick drink, and use the restroom before getting back on the road. But sometimes these isolated stops along the highway are the perfect hunting grounds for people with the darkest intentions. This is a lesson that a 17-year-old teenager learned on a cold night in North Carolina, and it is an experience that would change the way he looked at the world forever. At the time, he was just a regular teenager living in Georgia. He had big dreams of one day getting his commercial driver's license, also known as a CDL, so he could drive big semi-trucks across the country. His dad was already an experienced truck driver, so when his dad offered to let him tag along for a multi-day trip to North Carolina, the teenager jumped at the chance. It was supposed to be a fun learning experience, a way to see what life on the road was really like. They made the drive from Georgia to North Carolina in a single day. The drive was completely normal, and they arrived at their destination ahead of schedule. Their delivery was set for very early the next morning, somewhere around midnight or 1 o'clock. Because they had some time to kill, they decided to pull into a rest area for the night, so his dad could get some rest before the big drop-off. The parking lot of the rest area was completely packed. There were massive semi-trucks parked side by side in every single spot, their engines humming quietly in the dark. It seemed like a safe and secure place. As soon as they parked, the teenager's dad went straight to sleep in the back cabin of the truck. He was exhausted from hours of driving, but the teenager was a total night owl. He sat in the passenger seat, scrolling on his phone, watching the minutes tick by. By the time 2 o'clock in the morning rolled around, he decided to use the restroom. He also decided to bring his personal razor with him, assuming the restroom would be completely empty at this hour. Back home, he loved taking his time with his grooming routine, and he figured he could do the exact same thing here without anyone bothering him. He opened the truck door, stepped down into the cool night air, and walked toward the brick restroom building. The walk was quiet, and there was nobody else walking around. When you first enter this particular restroom, it is split into 2 distinct sections. There is a left side and a right side. The teenager decided to walk into the left side first, but the moment he stepped through the entrance, he realized he was not alone. Standing near the urinals was a man, and this was not just any ordinary man. He was absolutely massive. The teenager estimated that the man was at least 6 feet 4 inches tall. He had clean clothes and a well-kept beard, meaning he did not look homeless or like he was struggling with drug addiction. He just looked like an incredibly large man, standing in a public restroom in the middle of the night. The teenager tried not to make a big deal out of it. He walked past the giant, went into one of the stalls, and closed the door to use the bathroom. While he was in there, he expected to hear the man wash his hands and leave. But there was only silence. When the teenager finally came out of the stall to wash his hands at the sink, he noticed that the tall man was still standing in the exact same spot. He had not moved an inch. Just as the teenager was about to turn around and leave, the man suddenly unzipped his pants and began to use the urinal. It felt incredibly unnatural, almost as if the man had been waiting for the teenager to come out of the stall before acting. A wave of discomfort washed over the teenager. He did not want to stay in there with this strange man, but he still really wanted to line up his mustache. He decided to play it cool, to make it seem like he was leaving the building. He walked out of the left side of the restroom, but instead of heading back to the truck, he immediately walked into the right side of the restroom. He figured the tall man would stay on the left side, leaving him completely alone on the right side to finish his grooming. He stood in front of the large mirror, took out his razor, and began to carefully line up his mustache. But just 10 seconds later, the heavy door to the right side of the restroom slowly swung open. The teenager looked up and his heart dropped. It was the exact same tall man. There was absolutely no logical reason for this man to follow him. He had already been on the other side of the building, and he had already used the urinal. The man began to walk slowly toward the teenager. The teenager was terrified, but he tried to maintain his composure. He kept his razor held firmly in his hand. As the tall man got closer, he suddenly stopped right behind the teenager. The teenager watched him through the reflection of the mirror. He noticed that the man had a look of genuine shock on his face. It was as if the man had expected to corner an easy, defenseless target, but when he saw the sharp razor blade held tightly in the teenager's hand, his entire demeanor changed. The teenager knew he was in a highly dangerous situation. He was only 17 years old, standing 5 feet 9 inches tall, while this man was a giant in his late 30s or early 40s who could easily overpower him, trying to keep his hands from shaking. The teenager continued to line up his mustache. The tall man then walked over to a urinal and pretended to unzip his pants, but he was not actually using the restroom. He was staring directly at the teenager's reflection in the mirror, watching his every move. The man gave a slight nod. The teenager, wanting to avoid a physical confrontation and hoping to make the man think he was completely oblivious, nodded back. A few seconds later, the man walked into an empty stall. But instead of closing the door and using the bathroom, he just stood completely still in the dark corner of the stall, staring out at the teenager with wide, manic eyes. It was a deeply unsettling sight. The teenager pretended not to notice. He kept his focus on the mirror, waiting for an opportunity to escape. About 20 seconds later, the man stepped out of the stall again, walked back to the urinal, and repeated the exact same routine of pretending to unzip his pants while staring at the teenager. The teenager finally finished with his mustache. He knew he had to get out of there immediately. The only problem was that he had to walk directly past the tall man to reach the exit. He gripped his razor tightly, ready to slash at the man if he made a move. He walked past him, step by step, feeling the man's eyes burning into the back of his neck. Fortunately, the man did not move. The teenager rushed out the door and felt an immense wave of relief when he saw the security cameras mounted near the entrance. He ran back to the truck, where his dad was still fast asleep. He was so shaken up that he decided to text a friend and explain everything. His friend replied 20 minutes later and suggested that they go back into the restroom together on a FaceTime call so the friend could see the layout. For some reason, the teenager agreed. He walked back into the empty restroom, showing his friend where the tall man had stood and where he had stared from the stall. The man was gone, but the mystery did not end there. As the teenager stepped back outside and ended the call, he noticed a separate, smaller parking lot behind the rest area. This lot was meant for smaller passenger cars. There was only one car parked there. It was a red car, and its headlights were shining brightly in the pitch-black night. But the absolute second the teenager turned his head to look at the car, the headlights instantly shut off. The entire area plunged into darkness. The teenager could not see who was inside. Was it the same tall man waiting in his car, watching the restroom entrance? He did not want to find out. He ran back to the truck, climbed inside, and locked the doors. He never told his father about that night, because his father was extremely strict and had only recently started allowing him to go out alone. He knew that if he told him, his independence would be stripped away. But he would never forget the sheer terror of standing in that restroom, realizing how close he had come to a potentially fatal encounter. This feeling of being watched and targeted is something that many people experience, especially in busy, crowded cities where predators can easily blend into the background. For a young woman in her early 20s living in New York City, navigating the transit system was just a normal part of her daily routine. She had lived in the city her entire life, so taking the subway and the bus at any hour of the day or night felt like second nature to her. Her daily commute was incredibly long, taking about 2 hours each way. It involved riding 2 different trains, taking a 30-minute bus ride, and then walking 5 blocks down a dimly lit residential street to get to her house. Because she had done this for so many years, she rarely thought twice about her safety. But there were 2 specific nights that would forever be burned into her memory. The first night happened on a crowded subway train. She had just managed to squeeze through the doors right before they slid shut, so she remained standing near the entrance. She had her headphones plugged in, listening to music to pass the time. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a man who looked like he was homeless. He was shouting something in her direction. At first, she tried to ignore him, assuming he was just talking to himself like many people do on the subway, but he would not stop staring at her. His eyes were locked onto her face, and his expression was filled with intense anger. She decided to take out one of her earbuds and asked him what he had said. The moment she did, the man screamed a horrific, incredibly personal insult directly at her. Her heart instantly began to pound against her ribs. She could feel the blood rushing straight to her face, making her ears feel incredibly hot. In that moment of panic, she looked around the train car, desperately trying to make eye contact with any of the other passengers. She was silently begging for someone, anyone, to acknowledge what was happening and stand up for her. But nobody would look at her. Every single passenger immediately turned their heads away, staring at the floor or their phones, pretending that nothing was happening. When the train finally pulled into the next station, she did not hesitate. Even though it was not her stop, she stepped off the train and quickly walked down the platform to the next car over. She boarded the new car, desperately hoping the angry man had not seen where she went. She stood near the window, watching the platform with bated breath. 2 stops later, she finally saw the man step off the train and walk away. She had been holding her breath the entire time, and only when the doors closed behind him did she finally let out a sigh of relief. It was a terrifying reminder of how isolated you can feel, even when you are surrounded by dozens of people in a crowded subway car. But the second incident she experienced was far more calculated and dangerous. At the time, she was in graduate school, and her night classes did not finish until 8:30 in the evening. By the time she made her long commute and caught the bus back to her neighborhood, it was usually well after 10 o'clock at night. Late-night bus rides always had a very different atmosphere. They were much quieter, and the bus drivers would only pull over if a passenger specifically requested a stop. On this particular night, she was listening to a true crime podcast on her headphones. The story she was listening to was about a woman who was being followed by a dangerous stranger. Because of the spooky nature of the story, she decided to lower her volume and pay extra attention to her surroundings as she stepped off the bus. To get to her house, she had to walk past a few local shops before turning down a dark, residential dead-end street with incredibly poor lighting. As she walked past a Popeyes restaurant, she started debating whether she should go inside and grab some mac and cheese. She hesitated, walking almost to the end of the block, before finally deciding to turn around and get the food. The moment she turned around, she noticed a man who had gotten off the same bus as her. He had been walking behind her, but the second she changed her direction, the man completely froze in his tracks. He stood perfectly still, his eyes wide with surprise, staring directly at her. It was a highly unusual reaction, and it immediately made her feel incredibly uneasy. She tried to brush the feeling aside, telling herself he was just surprised by her sudden movement, and she walked into the Popeyes, inside the restaurant. The employees told her they were almost out of food because it was so close to closing time. She spent about a minute inside before deciding to leave empty-handed. She stepped back out onto the street and continued her walk home, but when she was halfway down the block, she saw him again. The man was standing right at the entrance of the dark, residential dead-end street that she had to walk down to get to her house. He was just standing there in the shadows, waiting for her to arrive. Her pace slowed down instantly. Her instincts were screaming at her that something was horribly wrong. She quickly pulled out her phone and called her brother. Her brother was usually never at home at this hour, so when he actually answered the phone, she felt an immense wave of relief. She didn't even have to explain how terrified she was. Her brother could hear the panic in her voice. The moment she told him she was near the Popeyes, he immediately told her that he was leaving the house and coming to meet her right now. Knowing her brother was on his way gave her the courage to keep moving. She turned down the dark street and walked past the waiting man. The moment she passed him, she heard the heavy sound of footsteps directly behind her. The man had started walking, matching her pace perfectly. As he walked closely behind her, he quietly whispered that he loved her, followed by a series of low mumbles that she could not understand. She knew she could not lead this man to her front door. She decided it would be much safer to stay in an area with more light. She turned around, walked back toward the commercial street, and decided to wait outside a nearby liquor store. She had lived in this neighborhood for her entire life, and she recognized many of the local men who usually hung around outside the store. She scanned the area, hoping to see a familiar face, but on this particular night, there was nobody she knew. That was when the stranger approached her again. He walked right up to her, repeatedly asking if she needed help. He insisted that he could help her, all while slowly stepping closer and closer, invading her personal space. She looked him dead in the eye and loudly said no. She repeated it multiple times, but the man completely ignored her words and continued to advance toward her. Then she noticed a terrifying detail. The man was wearing bright blue latex gloves. This incident occurred post-pandemic, so while many people were still cautious about germs, it made no sense for him to be wearing gloves. He was not wearing a face mask, and the weather outside was quite warm. There was no practical reason for him to have latex gloves on, unless he was planning to commit a crime and did not want to leave any fingerprints behind. The man began to repeatedly tell her that she needed to go home. He was using a highly pressuring tone, trying to force her to walk back down the dark, dead-end street where he could easily corner her. Fortunately, before he could make a move, he suddenly turned and walked into the liquor store. The moment he stepped inside, she turned the corner and saw her brother walking toward her. The entire encounter had lasted only 5 minutes, but to her it felt like hours. It is a strange thing about these terrifying situations. When you look back on them, they seem to have happened so fast, but while you are living through them, time seems to stop completely. She was left wondering what would have happened if her brother had not answered the phone, or what the man with the latex gloves was truly planning to do to her in the darkness of that dead-end street. While these stories highlight the terrifying reality of predators in public spaces, sometimes the danger comes directly to your own front door. In a relatively large city in southern Europe, a 19-year-old man lived in a very quiet residential neighborhood. The area was made up of small houses and cozy apartment buildings. It was the kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. It was actually quite boring most of the time. The young man knew all of his neighbors personally, and he had always felt completely safe walking around at any hour of the day or night. At the time, his life was very simple. He spent his weekdays attending lectures at his university, coming home to study for his exams, getting some sleep, and then repeating the exact same routine. He barely had any free time. But one Friday afternoon, his parents announced that they were going to visit some of their relatives in another city. They were leaving on Friday, staying through Saturday, and returning home on Sunday. This meant the 19-year-old would have the entire house to himself for the weekend. For a young guy who enjoyed his alone time, this was exciting news. He immediately called his friends and invited them to come over on Saturday to order food, play video games, and catch up. But before the weekend could begin, he had one last obligation on Friday evening. His university was hosting its annual geography quiz, and he had promised his classmates that he would participate. He was actually quite good at trivia, so he figured it would be a fun way to spend his Friday night. The event turned out to be a massive success. The university hall was packed to the brim with students. There was free food and drinks, and the atmosphere was incredibly lively. His team of 6 performed exceptionally well, finishing in second place out of 10 competing teams. They received a small award, took a group photo, and then it was time to head home. He hurried to catch the last subway train of the night. He got off at his usual station and began the 10-minute walk back to his house. It was October, so the night air was cold. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by one of the loudest, most blood-curdling screams he had ever heard. It was a man's voice, sounding like he was in extreme physical agony. The young man stopped dead in his tracks. Another scream followed, coming from the direction of his own house. He walked as fast as he could. As he rounded the corner near his house, he saw a group of 4 or 5 men. The moment they saw him, the group began to sprint directly toward him, shouting unintelligible things. The young man bolted toward his front door. As he reached the porch, his hands were shaking so violently that he dropped his keys on the ground. He scrambled to pick them up, unlocked the door, threw himself inside, and locked it shut. He stood in the pitch-black hallway, breathing heavily. He was completely alone. He called the emergency number, 112. The operator was not very helpful but promised to send a patrol car. Feeling a bit safer, he finally went to bed. The next night, his friend came over. After his friend left, the young man was watching a movie when he heard a loud bang, like a rock hitting his second-floor window. He stayed awake, sitting in the dark, alert to every single creak of the house. His parents returned the next day. They installed security cameras. Nothing strange has ever happened again, but he is still haunted by the unanswered questions of that weekend. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, We have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On July 15, 1976, a typical summer day was unfolding in the small town of Chowchilla, California. It was the kind of close-knit community where everyone knew each other and kids could play outside without their parents worrying. Around 4 o'clock, a school bus driver named Ed Ray was driving 26 students from Dairyland Elementary School back home. They had just spent a wonderful day on a summer class trip to the swimming pool at the Chowchilla Fairgrounds. Ed was a humble rancher who did this job because he loved the community. He was a stocky man about 55 years old, and a guy you would not want to pick a fight with. But to the kids, he was a gentle, patient soul they could always rely on. On this day, the bus was incredibly rowdy. The kids were excited, laughing, and still damp from swimming. Some of them were even singing. But as the bus turned onto Avenue 21, Ed noticed a white Dodge van blocking the road with its doors open. He tried to weave around the empty van, but a man in overalls with a pantyhose covering his face suddenly jumped out in front of the bus. Holding a revolver, the man walked up to the driver's side window and calmly asked Ed to open the door. Ed, wanting to keep the kids safe, opened it. Two more identically dressed men jumped in. One pointed a rifle at Ed and ordered everyone to the back. The man without the rifle drove the bus, while the man with the revolver followed in the van. They drove about a mile and parked in a bamboo thicket near the Chowchilla River. The entire ride was silent and terrifying. Once they stopped, 12 kids were moved into the white van. Ed and the remaining 14 kids were forced into the back of a second green van. This green van had a solid partition separating the driver's seat from the back, and all the windows were sealed shut. For 11 hours, Ed and the kids sat in total darkness and extreme heat. To keep the younger children calm, some of the older kids started to sing songs in the dark, including the song If You're Happy and You Know It. Back in town, parents began to worry when the bus was just 15 minutes late. Ed was always on time. Within an hour, news of the missing bus spread, and parents helped police trace the route. By that evening, they found the abandoned bus in the bamboo thicket. The FBI was called, and 30 agents arrived on the scene to start a massive search. Meanwhile, late that night, the vans finally stopped at a rock quarry in Livermore, which was about 100 miles away. It was 3:30 in the morning, and Ed had been awake for over 24 hours. When the back doors opened, two of the captors were waiting. Ed was ordered out first. They handed him a flashlight, told him to strip off his clothes, and ordered him down a ladder into a hole. As the children were led out one by one, their names were written down for a roll call. Each child was forced to undress and climb down the ladder into what turned out to be an old moving van buried 12 feet underground. Ed immediately worried that the ceiling would cave in or that they would all suffocate. There were 2 air hoses running to the surface, some mattresses on the floor, some water jugs, Wonder Bread, peanut butter, potato chips, and holes cut into the floor for toilets. Once everyone was inside, a captor yelled down that they would be back. Then they slid a steel plate over the opening. Immediately after, the children heard heavy thuds on top of the van. The captors were shoveling dirt on top of the trailer, burying them alive. Panic broke out inside the dark space. Ed did his best to keep everyone calm. He and a 14-year-old boy named Michael Marshall tried to push against the heavy lid, but it was impossible to move. Ed instructed everyone to eat some food and get some rest. 12 hours later, the food was gone, and the ventilation system stopped working. The hot July air filled the tight space and the roof began to cave in. Ed knew they were running out of time. Ed and Michael piled up the mattresses to reach the roof. The escape hatch was blocked by a heavy sheet of metal and weighted down with 2 100-pound industrial batteries. For hours, Ed and Michael wedged the lid open with a piece of wood and moved the heavy batteries. They dug through the remaining dirt and finally broke through to the surface. It had been 16 hours since they were buried. They walked to the quarry's guard shack, where a security guard called the police. When the police arrived at the guard shack, they immediately saw how severely dehydrated and exhausted the children and Ed Ray were. They had been trapped in extreme heat with barely any clean water, and their skin was caked in thick dirt and sweat from their desperate escape attempt. The officers did not waste any time. They loaded everyone into patrol cars and rushed them to the Santa Rita Rehabilitation Center, which was the nearest secure county facility. There, nurses and medical staff evaluated each person. They handed out clean clothes, warm meals, and plenty of water. The children were finally reunited with their frantic parents, who had spent the last 36 hours thinking they would never see their sons and daughters alive again. As soon as the children were safe, the local sheriff and the FBI turned their full attention to the rock quarry. They knew the kidnappers had to have intimate knowledge of the property to bury a giant moving van 12 feet underground without anyone noticing. It was not long before investigators discovered that the quarry was owned by a wealthy local man. When they looked closer, they found that his son, Frederick Newhall Woods, and two of his friends, James and Richard Schoenfeld, had been deep in debt. Investigators executed a search warrant on the property and found a draft of a ransom note demanding $5 million from the state. They also found physical evidence linking the three men directly to the purchase of the green and white vans. At the trial, they were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Richard was paroled in 2012, James was paroled in 2015, and Frederick Woods was finally granted parole in March of this year. Many people in Chowchilla and around the country were deeply upset that these men were ever allowed to walk free after committing such a monstrous crime. Ed Ray passed away in 2012, but he is still remembered as a hero who saved 26 lives. While the Chowchilla story is famous, there are other terrifying encounters on school buses that rarely make the national news. One of these occurred on October 20, 1995, in a rural area of Virginia. A 14-year-old high school student named Donald, who wished to have his last name left out of the public record, was riding a school bus back from a band field trip. He played in the school band and had spent the entire day participating in a big regional music competition. The bus driver was a friendly man named Bob, who was well liked by all the teenagers on board. He loved his job and was always happy to chat with the students. It was around 10 o'clock at night when the event finished, and they began the 45-minute drive back to the high school. The bus was traveling down Route 58, a quiet highway surrounded by thick woods. There were almost no other cars on the road. Soon, the students in the back of the bus noticed a car driving incredibly close to their bumper. Bob tried to change lanes to let the aggressive driver pass, but the car simply stayed right behind them, tailgating them dangerously. Eventually, the car sped past the bus in the right lane, and some of the kids shouted out the windows at the driver until their chaperone told them to stop. Donald figured it was just an angry driver and that the incident was over, but just a few minutes later, the bus suddenly slammed on its brakes so hard that the students were nearly thrown from their seats. The brakes let out a loud, piercing shriek. The bus came to a dead stop in the middle of the dark highway. Bob put the bus into reverse for a brief moment, then shifted back into drive and stopped again. He turned around and yelled for everyone to stay quiet and not to panic. His tense voice made everyone nervous. Suddenly, the students heard men shouting outside. The bus doors hissed open, and two men wearing black pullover masks and carrying handguns stepped onto the bus. The armed men yelled at everyone to shut up. They told the teenagers to empty their wallets of all their cash and hand over any jewelry they were wearing. They began moving down the aisle, pointing their guns directly at the terrified students. Donald later recalled looking down the barrel of a gun at just 14 years old. He felt completely frozen, knowing that one wrong move could end his life right there. The robbers were hurried and anxious, likely worried that another vehicle would drive by on the highway. Before they even reached the back of the bus, they took what they had gathered and ran out the door. They jumped into their car and sped away down Route 58 with the headlights turned off. Their license plates had been covered up, proving this was a carefully planned ambush. Following the armed robbery on Route 58, the community was left in shock. Bob, the beloved bus driver, felt guilty for opening the doors, even though he had no choice. The police set up roadblocks, but since the robbers had covered their license plates, there were very few clues to follow. Donald and his classmates returned to school, but they were deeply shaken, constantly checking behind them on every bus ride. Another shocking incident occurred more recently, this past February, on a dark stretch of the N4 highway in Witbank, South Africa. A school bus was carrying 4 teachers and a driver back from an athletics competition. There were no students on board at the time. What the teachers did not know was that a gang of robbers had deliberately placed large, heavy rocks across the highway, hoping to disable passing vehicles so they could rob the passengers. The bus hit the rocks at high speed, immediately rupturing a tire. The driver had no choice but to pull over onto the dark shoulder of the road. As soon as the bus stopped, 3 men rushed out from the darkness. 2 of them were armed with handguns, and the third held a large knife. They forced their way onto the bus and began demanding everyone's valuables. The criminals took cell phones, cash, jewelry, and even a smartwatch. During the robbery, one of the men struck the bus driver in the face with the butt of a gun, causing a minor injury to his jaw. Once they had stolen everything they could find, the robbers disappeared back into the night. Sometime later, a passing tow driver pulled over to help them. One of the teachers used the tow truck driver's phone to call her fiancé, who then contacted the police. Although an investigation was launched immediately, the robbers have still not been caught. Local school officials in Whitbank quickly issued warnings to all transit drivers, urging them to watch for road debris. These stories show us that school buses, because they carry many passengers, can sometimes become attractive targets for dangerous criminals. In these terrifying moments, the courage of people like Ed Ray and the quick thinking of everyday people are often the only things standing between survival and tragedy. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. My husband works at a tech company, and I stay at home raising our kids, who are 10, 7, and 3. Our grocery bills are quite high, so I go food shopping at least twice a week. I usually go to the King Cullen near our house, though I sometimes go to the nearby Target as well. Those are 2 of a very small list of grocery stores in our quiet town. To give as much context as possible, we are an Italian family, and I am currently 40 years old. This happened not even a year ago, when I was 39. I was running behind on shopping one day, so I went much later than usual. The King Cullen closes at 10, and it was definitely past 9 o'clock already, so I hurried over to the store with my flyers and coupons. The kids were complaining about a lack of food in the house, so I had to get a quick grocery run in. Most days, I would have to go shopping with my 3-year-old daughter, Haley. But since it was late, and my husband was home from work, for once I was able to go shopping alone, which I consider a luxury. I arrived at the King Cullen, which was pretty empty since it would soon be closing. I grabbed a cart and quickly started doing my laps down the aisles, grabbing whatever was on my list. I was in the cereal aisle when I got a tap on my shoulder, which startled me. I turned and saw a very tan man about my height with a baseball cap on, a black t-shirt, a red zip-up hoodie, and jeans. He laughed and apologized for startling me. He said he'd been looking everywhere for a specific bag of chips that was in my cart and asked where I found them. I politely told him the aisle, but he said he checked and couldn't find it. So, I actually walked him exactly to where I found the chips. He thanked me with his awful breath, and I smiled and was about to walk back to my cart. But then he started making pointless conversation with me about why he liked those chips so much, talking about the ingredients, or a lack of a specific ingredient. I kept trying to make it obvious that I was inching my way back to my cart. He wouldn't get the hint though. It was when he made a weird pause and then said, "Gosh, you're pretty," that I said thank you and told him I had to get back to my shopping before they closed. I went to my cart, but he followed me and kept talking to me. At this point, as politely as I could, I told him I really would just like to shop in peace. He finally seemed to get the hint and walked away, but for the rest of my time in the store that night, I kept seeing that man circling the aisles. Each time he walked past the aisle I was in, he'd slow down or even stop and just look down at me. I was getting increasingly uncomfortable and hurried up my shopping. When I was finally done, I went to the checkout, and as I emptied my cart, here comes the red hoodie guy with a whole 2 or 3 items. He waited in line right behind me. He didn't say a word anymore, but I felt his gaze even through the back of my head. I was done checking out, pushed my cart away, and the man called out, "Have a good night, ma'am." I ignored it. As I was unloading my car, I noticed the red hoodie guy in the parking lot looking at me as he walked to his car. He got into a junky-looking Honda that must have been like 30 years old. He didn't turn the car on though, he just sat in it. I finally finished loading my car, so I got inside, started it, and began driving out of the parking lot. I looked in my rearview mirror a few times and didn't see any headlights behind me, so I felt safe to drive home. It wasn't until I pulled into the driveway and looked to my left down the street that I realized there was a car with its headlights off, driving slowly down the street, approaching our house. He pulled to the curb a few houses down. It looked to be that same Honda from the parking lot. I went inside the house and called my husband's name. He came downstairs looking concerned, and I told him I was followed home by a creep. He hurried outside to the stoop, but by this time, the car was already gone. The following weekend, late at night when we were all in bed, we heard some shuffling around outside in the side yard. I shook my husband to go check what it was, and he went to slide the window open. He saw someone right below the window, trying to open the side gate to the backyard. But after hearing the window slide open, the man looked up and started to run. My husband grabbed the baseball bat from under the bed and ran outside. When he came back a minute later, he said he saw the car speeding down the street, and he tried to chase after it. He perfectly described the shitty Honda that the red hoodie guy was driving. It was undoubtedly him. We phoned the police, and given the late hour, an officer arrived at our house in under 5 minutes. I described the man and his car the best I could, and that was that. He never returned to our house, especially not after seeing my angry husband chasing his car on foot with a bat. Still, it remains incredibly uncomfortable that a creep like that knows exactly where I live. Now, if you think grocery stores are only creepy during the late hours of the evening, wait until you hear what happened to a college student working the graveyard shift at a completely different supermarket. When I was in college, I worked at a local supermarket called Waldbaum's. The one I worked at was a 24-hour store, so a couple of unfortunate people would always be stuck working that awful shift. I thought since I was young and in college, my boss would never put me on an overnight shift, but unfortunately, since she had my school schedule and knew I was off Mondays and Wednesdays, she saw me as the perfect sucker to stick on the overnight shift. One day, I saw that I was scheduled for a Tuesday night from midnight to 8 in the morning. I had to triple check the schedule to make sure that was right. I felt sick seeing that. When I asked my supervisor, he told me that since I was over 18, I didn't really have a choice. I considered quitting, but I needed the money, so I decided to do it just this once. I arrived at the store at midnight and relieved my coworker Amanda. Half the lights in the store were out at this hour to save on electricity. There was a surprising amount of customers early on, but past 1 in the morning, the place was completely dead. Maybe 3 customers came in during the entire hour. As it got later, there were less and less people. It was past 2 in the morning, and I was bored out of my mind. There hadn't been a customer in over an hour. I wondered if there were any other employees in the building. There had to be, because they couldn't have a lone 20-year-old running the whole place by himself. Just then, a bald guy who looked like he could be a manager kept passing by the front registers. He had a key ring attached to his khakis with about 10 keys on it, and he was holding a small backpack in his hand. I said, "Excuse me, are you the manager?" He came over and asked if it was my first day, to which I replied that it was my first night shift. He shook my hand without giving me his name and asked me to go to the back warehouse to organize the pallets, saying he'd watch the front registers. I didn't exactly know what that meant, but I figured I'd learn. As I walked to the back, I saw him doing something to the entrance door, like he was reaching for a switch on the side of it to lock it. I made my way into the back warehouse, where I saw a tall man who looked like he was 30, wearing a manager's vest that said Waldbaum's. He saw my apron and introduced himself as Rob, the night manager. I said, "Oh, I thought the guy in the front was the night manager." He looked puzzled and asked who I was talking about. When I described the man, he asked me to show him, because he was the only manager on duty. We didn't even make it out of the warehouse before all the lights in the store suddenly turned off. Rob told me to wait in the warehouse while he checked out what was going on. I watched as he walked through the warehouse doors into the pitch-black store, with the only light out there being from the dairy coolers that were still on. I sat on a box on the pallet and was on my phone, trying to text any of my friends who could be awake, when I heard a door from inside the warehouse opening. It was on the other side of the warehouse, separated by the freezer. There were 2 ways in and out of the warehouse back into the store. I sat there with my ears perked up, listening for any sounds, when I heard quiet, slow footsteps getting closer, followed by a voice saying, "Hey kid, you in here?" But it wasn't Rob's voice. It was that bald guy's voice. I hurried out the warehouse doors into the store, but quietly. I jogged to the front of the store looking for Rob, but I couldn't find him. I called out his name, but nothing. I grabbed my jacket and tried to open the exit door, but it wouldn't open automatically. I tried to physically open it, but it was locked. I heard footsteps approaching from behind me, and I turned around, almost screaming, but I realized it was Rob. He flicked some lever on the top right of the door and unlocked it, telling me in a panicked whisper to hurry and get outside. He followed behind me, and we left the store. He got right on the phone with the police, saying he believed an armed man locked himself inside the Waldbaums and was trying to rob the place. I told him to tell the police that I think the man was coming to harm me in the warehouse, which he relayed to the operator. He told me I should wait in my car. Within 10 minutes, there were at least 4 police cars outside. They all went inside for a while, and I didn't see whatever was going on, so I left. The next time I went into work, I was told all about what happened by my supervisor. The security footage showed that bald man circling the place, acting suspicious, and checking if the coast was clear. After locking the doors, he cut the lights and went straight to the warehouse where he had told me to go. That's the scariest part to me, because if he was armed, he could have been on his way to put a gun to my head. The camera showed him leaving through the emergency exit in the warehouse way before the police arrived. In the end, I never worked an overnight shift again, and I stayed at that job for another few months. I'm not sure if that man was ever identified. I used to work as a night restock worker at a supermarket in a somewhat rural town. The store was called Great American, and it was the biggest and best supermarket in our entire area. My shift would start as soon as the store closed at 10 o'clock at night, and I would usually work from 10 to about 3 in the morning at the latest, restocking the shelves and organizing everything before the next operating day. I, of course, had the keys to the store for the after-hours work. It was always supposed to be a team of 2 people, consisting of myself and 1 other worker, either Terry, Carter, or Alfonso. On this night, I was scheduled to work with Terry. I arrived at the store on time, let himself in, and started my work using the pallet jack to bring a whole pallet of boxes out to the floor. I started with the bread and nuts aisle, rotating the older loaves to the front and putting the newer ones in the back. Halfway through, I realized I hadn't seen Terry yet. I walked to the back area of the store where the inventory was, which is where we usually leave our belongings. He wasn't back there. I had left the back door cracked open with a rubber door stopper for him, so he could easily get in when he showed up. I went back to work for another half hour, and with still no sign of Terry, I once again walked to the back of the store. He still wasn't there, but I noticed the back door was shut. I assumed that meant Terry was here somewhere. I went to open the door and saw the rubber door stopper was lying outside, which I thought was incredibly weird. I called Terry's name, and it echoed through the room, but he didn't call back. I decided to call him on his phone. He picked up sounding like he was in bed, and I asked him if he was at work. He told me he wasn't coming in tonight because he was sick. Suddenly, I got the chills. I told him someone kicked the door stopper off the door, but he said it could have just come undone itself. Since nobody else was scheduled to work that night, I was completely alone. I told him to feel better and we hung up. I wasn't convinced that the door stopper came undone itself because I had kicked it under the door pretty tightly. I did a quick look around just to make sure no one was in the back of the store, and when I didn't see anyone, I went back to work, though I felt a slight sense of unease the whole time. I was stocking the remainder of the bread when I heard a loud sound echo from across the shopping floor. Now, someone had to be in here. I got off my knees and went to the middle aisle that intersected all the other aisles. I looked straight down and stood there for a hot second. All the way on the opposite side of the store, in the dairy aisle, a man dressed in black walked past, looking down in my direction. I felt my heart drop. I had to think logically that maybe this was someone else filling in for Terry's shift that our boss forgot to tell me about. I started to speed walk down the center aisle and yelled, "Excuse me," very loudly. I looked to the left down every aisle I passed, since he went towards the front of the store, In one of those aisles, he was waiting at the end of it, standing there fully facing my direction. When he saw me, he walked out of sight in the direction I was just coming from. I yelled, "Excuse me," again and started to run down that aisle to catch up to him. I didn't get a good look at his face yet. When I got to the front of the aisle by the cash registers, I looked down the direction he went and saw him all the way at the end by the bread aisle. Half his body was hidden behind the shelf. His mouth was hanging open, and he started to wave me over, but he didn't say anything. His face was absolutely freaking me out. I attempted one more time to speak to him and said, "Who are you?" and he disappeared behind the shelf. I wasn't being paid enough for this. I went outside to sit in my car and call my boss. He picked up, and I told him there was some random freak roaming around the store. He told me to get him out of there if I can, or call the police to handle it. I was not going to attempt to physically remove a crazy person, so I called 911. I waited in my car until a police car showed up. I greeted the officer and asked him to follow me inside. We walked around the place looking for the man, and we saw him at one of the aisles, creepily standing there as if playing a game. When the officer commanded him to come here, he actually listened. He was put in handcuffs, and he was the strangest man I had ever seen. He kept smiling and looking at me non-stop, licking his lips. The only words he spoke were when answering the officer, saying he was looking for a snack. I hated the menacing, threatening smile he gave me. I continued my work after they left, but I never left any doors open again. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.